Good evening, dear listeners, and welcome to this peaceful journey through time as we settle together beside the warm glow of flickering flames and drift slowly back through the centuries to explore the vast and ancient Persian Empire. Tonight you can simply close your eyes and let your mind wander gently across the sands of time while we discover the quiet stories of long-ago kings and their sprawling kingdoms that stretched from the Mediterranean Sea all the way to the distant borders of India. The fire crackles softly beside us, casting dancing shadows on the walls as we prepare to embark on this gentle exploration of one of history's most magnificent empires. You can feel yourself becoming more and more relaxed as we settle into our comfortable space and allow the soothing rhythm of these ancient tales to wash over you like a warm, gentle breeze. There is no rush tonight and nowhere else you need to be as we slowly unfold the peaceful story of the Persian Empire from its humble beginnings in the mountains of Iran to its eventual encounter with the young Macedonian conqueror Alexander. Tonight we will travel together through 8 hours of quiet history, beginning with a Persian prince named Cyrus, who would become known to history as Cyrus the Great. We will follow his gentle conquests as he united the scattered tribes of his homeland and then expanded his kingdom across the known world with a wisdom and tolerance that was remarkable for his time. The Persians were different from many ancient conquerors because they often allowed the peoples they conquered to keep their own customs and religions, creating a vast multicultural empire that functioned peacefully for over 2 centuries. As you listen to these stories, you might find your breathing becoming slower and deeper, while the gentle cadence of these historical accounts helps your mind release the tensions of the day. The Persian Empire lasted for more than 200 years, and during that time it was home to dozens of different peoples speaking countless languages and worshipping various gods, yet somehow this diverse collection of nations and tribes managed to coexist under the wise rule of Persian kings who governed from their magnificent capital cities. You can imagine yourself sitting beside an ancient Persian road, watching the steady flow of merchants and travelers making their way along the royal road that connected the far corners of the empire. Caravans loaded with silk and spices would pass by, while messages from the king traveled swiftly on horseback from one administrative center to another. The Persians built an incredible network of roads and communication systems that allowed them to govern their vast territories effectively while still maintaining the local traditions and customs of their many subject peoples. The story we are about to explore together begins in the mountainous region of what is now modern Iran, where a collection of Indo-European tribes had settled many centuries before the rise of the Persian Empire. These tribes included the Medes and the Persians, who were related peoples sharing similar languages and customs. For generations they lived quietly in their mountain valleys, raising livestock and practicing a form of agriculture adapted to their highland environment. The rhythm of their lives followed the changing seasons as they moved their herds to summer pastures and returned to sheltered valleys for the winter months. The Persian tribes were known for their skill as horsemen and their expertise in archery, which would later become crucial elements in their military success. They lived in a society organized around extended families and clans, with leadership often based on a combination of hereditary rank and personal ability. Their religion centered around the worship of natural forces and the ancient Indo-European gods, though this would later evolve under the influence of the prophet Zoroaster, whose teachings emphasized the cosmic struggle between good and evil, light and darkness. In the early 6th century before our common era, the Persian tribes found themselves subject to the powerful kingdom of Media, which had emerged as the dominant force in the Iranian highlands. The Median Empire had grown strong through its conquest of the ancient Assyrian Empire and controlled much of what is now Iran and eastern Turkey. The Median kings ruled from their capital at Ecbatana, which was described by ancient writers as a magnificent city with walls of different colors, representing the 7 heavens of their religious cosmology. Under Median rule, the Persian tribes were expected to provide tribute and military service, but they were allowed to maintain their traditional way of life and their own local leaders. This arrangement worked reasonably well for several generations as the Persians focused on their pastoral activities while the Medians concerned themselves with governing their larger empire and conducting diplomacy with the other great powers of the ancient world, including Babylon and Lydia. However, in the middle of the 6th century, a remarkable young man emerged among the Persian nobility who would change the course of world history. His name was Cyrus, and he belonged to the Achaemenid clan, which had long held a position of leadership among the Persian tribes. According to the stories passed down through generations, Cyrus was born around 600 BCE, though the exact details of his early life have become mixed with legend over the centuries, making it difficult to separate historical fact from the mythical accounts that grew up around his memory. The historian Herodotus tells us a fascinating story about Cyrus's birth and early years, though scholars today debate how much of this account reflects actual historical events. According to Herodotus, the Median king Astyages had a prophetic dream that his daughter's son would one day overthrow his kingdom. When his daughter Mandane gave birth to Cyrus, the king ordered that the infant be killed to prevent the fulfillment of this disturbing prophecy. However, the nobleman assigned to carry out this task could not bring himself to murder the baby and instead gave the child to a shepherd to raise in the mountains. Whether or not these stories contain historical truth, they reflect the ancient world's fascination with the idea that great leaders often have mysterious or humble origins that later give way to extraordinary destiny. What we can say with more confidence is that Cyrus grew up among the Persian nobility and received the education and training appropriate to someone of his social position. This would have included instruction in horsemanship, archery, and the arts of war, as well as exposure to the Persian legal and religious traditions. The Persians had a strong cultural emphasis on truthfulness and honor, which would later become one of the defining characteristics of Cyrus's approach to rulership. Persian noble children were taught that lying was one of the worst possible sins and that a man's word was his most precious possession. They learned to ride horses almost as soon as they could walk, and by adolescence they were expected to be skilled archers capable of shooting accurately while mounted on a galloping horse. As Cyrus reached adulthood, he would have participated in the traditional Persian lifestyle of seasonal migration with the tribal herds, and he would have gained experience in the complex negotiations required to maintain harmony between different clan groups. The Persian social system required its leaders to be skilled diplomats capable of building consensus and maintaining loyalty among proud and independent-minded warriors. These early experiences in tribal politics would prove invaluable when Cyrus later found himself governing the diverse populations of his growing empire. Sometime around 550 BCE, when Cyrus was approximately 50 years old, he began to challenge Median authority over the Persian tribes. The exact circumstances that led to this rebellion are not entirely clear from the ancient sources, but it appears that Cyrus had gradually built up a coalition of Persian clans who were dissatisfied with Median rule and ready to support his bid for independence. The rebellion seems to have started as a relatively small-scale affair, but it quickly gathered momentum as more and more Persian warriors rallied to Cyrus's banner. The Median king Astyages initially underestimated the threat posed by his Persian vassals and sent a relatively small army to suppress what he probably viewed as a minor tribal uprising. However, when this force encountered Cyrus's growing army, many of the Median soldiers defected to the Persian cause, either because they had family connections among the Persian tribes or because they were impressed by Cyrus's leadership and promises of fair treatment. For those who joined him, This pattern of defection and voluntary submission would become one of the hallmarks of Cyrus's military campaigns throughout his career. Rather than relying solely on conquest through force, Cyrus had a remarkable ability to win over his enemies through a combination of military skill, political wisdom, and genuine respect for local customs and traditions. He understood that lasting peace and prosperity required the willing cooperation of his subjects rather than mere submission based on fear. The war between the Persians and the Medes lasted approximately 3 years and culminated in a decisive battle near the Median capital of Ecbatana. According to Herodotus, many of Astyages' own troops abandoned him during the final confrontation, leaving the Median king virtually defenseless against Cyrus's advancing army. Rather than executing his defeated enemy, as might have been expected, Cyrus treated Astyages with respect and allowed him to live comfortably in retirement, though he was no longer permitted to exercise political power. This merciful treatment of a defeated enemy was highly unusual in the ancient world, where victorious kings typically killed their rivals to eliminate any possibility of future rebellion. Cyrus's decision to spare Astyages and treat him honorably sent a powerful message to other potential enemies that submission to Persian rule did not necessarily mean death or humiliation. This policy of clemency would become one of the most effective tools in Cyrus's diplomatic arsenal and would help him build the largest empire the world had yet seen. With the defeat of the Median Empire, Cyrus found himself in control of a vast territory stretching from the borders of Lydia in the west to the edges of the Central Asian steppes in the east. However, rather than simply replacing Median administrators with Persian officials, Cyrus chose to maintain much of the existing governmental structure, while gradually integrating Persian and Median elites into a unified ruling class. This pragmatic approach to governance allowed him to consolidate his conquests much more quickly than would have been possible through a complete reorganization of the administrative system. The former Median Empire included numerous subject peoples and tributary states, each with their own distinctive languages, cultures, and religious practices. Cyrus recognized that attempting to impose Persian customs on all these diverse groups would likely provoke widespread rebellion and make his empire impossible to govern effectively. Instead, he adopted a policy of tolerance and accommodation that allowed local communities to maintain their traditional ways of life as long as they remained loyal to his rule and paid their required taxes and tribute. This inclusive approach to imperial governance was revolutionary for its time and would become one of the defining characteristics of the Persian Empire throughout its long history. Most ancient empires were built on the principle of cultural dominance, with the conquering people imposing their language, religion, and customs on their subjects. The Persians developed a different model that emphasized political unity combined with cultural diversity, creating a vast multicultural state that could accommodate peoples as different as the sophisticated city dwellers of Mesopotamia and the nomadic tribes of Central Asia. Under Cyrus's leadership, the administrative capital of the empire remained at Ecbatana during the summer months, when the Persian court could take advantage of the cooler climate in the Median highlands. During the winter, the court would typically move to Susa or other cities in the lowlands where the weather was more temperate. This pattern of seasonal movement reflected the Persians' nomadic heritage and allowed the king to maintain personal contact with different regions of his realm throughout the year. The Persian Empire that emerged under Cyrus was organized around a network of provinces called satrapies, each governed by a Persian noble or a trusted local ruler who served as the king's representative. These provincial governors or satraps were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and providing military forces when required for imperial campaigns. However, they were also expected to respect local customs and work with existing religious and community leaders rather than attempting to impose a uniform Persian culture throughout their territories. This decentralized system of government allowed the Persian Empire to expand rapidly while maintaining stability in conquered territories. Local populations found that Persian rule often brought benefits including improved security, better roads, and increased trade opportunities while requiring relatively few changes to their traditional way of life. The Persians were also notably tolerant in religious matters, often supporting local temples and festivals rather than attempting to suppress non-Persian forms of worship. As word of Cyrus's victories and his enlightened approach to governance spread throughout the ancient world, many rulers and city-states began to view Persian expansion as less threatening than conquest by other imperial powers. Some communities even invited Persian protection or voluntarily submitted to Cyrus's authority in order to gain the benefits of membership in his growing empire. This phenomenon of voluntary submission would prove crucial to the rapid expansion of Persian power in the decades following Cyrus's victory over the Medes. The success of Cyrus's rebellion against Median rule also demonstrated to the ancient world that the established balance of power could be dramatically altered by a skilled and determined leader. Prior to Cyrus's rise, the ancient Near East had been dominated by four great powers: Media, Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt. These kingdoms had maintained a relatively stable balance for several generations, with no single power able to achieve decisive dominance over the others. Cyrus's emergence as the ruler of a unified Persian-Median empire upset this balance and set the stage for a new round of imperial expansion that would ultimately bring most of the known world under Persian control. The transformation of the Persian tribes from Median vassals to masters of their own empire occurred with remarkable speed, reflecting both Cyrus's exceptional leadership abilities and the underlying strength and unity of Persian society. The Persian warriors who followed Cyrus were tough, experienced fighters accustomed to the harsh conditions of life on the Iranian plateau. They were also motivated by a strong sense of tribal loyalty and pride that made them formidable opponents in battle. Perhaps most importantly, they were led by a king who combined military skill with political wisdom, and who had already demonstrated his ability to build a stable and prosperous state. As we continue our peaceful journey through this ancient history, you can feel yourself becoming more and more relaxed while these gentle stories of long-ago kings and their vast empires flow over you like a warm, soothing breeze. The fire continues to crackle softly beside us, casting its gentle light as we explore the remarkable transformation of a collection of mountain tribes into the foundation of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known. Tomorrow, when you wake, you may find that these quiet tales of Persian history have provided a restful interlude that helped your mind release the concerns of the modern world and drift peacefully into restorative sleep. With the gentle flames still dancing beside us, we continue our peaceful journey through the ancient Persian Empire as we follow the remarkable conquests of Cyrus the Great after his successful rebellion against the Median kingdom. Having established himself as the ruler of a united Persian-Median empire, Cyrus now turned his attention to the other great powers of the ancient world and began a series of campaigns that would transform his mountain kingdom into the largest empire in human history up to that time. You can feel yourself settling deeper into relaxation as we explore these quiet stories of ancient conquest and diplomacy, where battles were often won through wisdom and negotiation rather than violence alone. The Persian approach to empire building was notably different from that of earlier conquerors who typically relied on fear and destruction to subdue their enemies. Cyrus and his successors developed a more sophisticated strategy that emphasized incorporation rather than elimination, allowing conquered peoples to maintain their cultural identity while becoming productive members of the Persian imperial system. After consolidating his control over the former Median territories, Cyrus, faced the challenge of dealing with the kingdom of Lydia, which controlled much of western Anatolia and represented a potential threat to Persian expansion toward the Mediterranean coast. The Lydian kingdom was ruled by King Croesus, who was famous throughout the ancient world for his incredible wealth derived largely from the gold deposits found in Lydian rivers and the kingdom's position as a major center of international trade. Croesus had built his capital at Sardis into one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world, where merchants from across the known world came to trade in luxury goods and precious metals. The Lydians were credited with being among the first peoples to develop coined money, which revolutionized commerce and made Sardis a crucial financial center connecting the Greek cities of the Aegean coast with the inland trade routes that carried goods from as far away as Central Asia and India. The relationship between Lydia and the emerging Persian Empire began to deteriorate sometime around 547 BCE when Cyrus's expanding influence in Anatolia came into conflict with Lydian territorial claims and commercial interests. According to the ancient historians, the immediate cause of the war was a border dispute involving the city of Tyre, which both kingdoms claimed as part of their legitimate sphere of influence. However, the underlying tension reflected the broader geopolitical reality that the ancient world was not large enough to accommodate two expanding empires in the same region. Croesus initially attempted to build a coalition of allies to resist Persian expansion, and he sent envoys to Egypt, Babylon, and Sparta seeking military support for a war against Cyrus. The Egyptian pharaoh and the Babylonian king both promised aid, though their assistance would prove to be largely symbolic rather than substantial when the actual fighting began. The Spartans agreed to provide military support, but the great distance between Greece and Anatolia made it difficult for them to deliver meaningful help in a timely manner. Before committing to war, Croesus reportedly consulted the famous oracle at Delphi, asking whether he should attack the Persian Empire. The oracle's response was characteristically ambiguous, stating that if Croesus crossed the Halys River and attacked Cyrus, he would destroy a great empire. Interpreting this prophecy as a favorable omen, Croesus proceeded with his plans for war without realizing that the empire destined for destruction might be his own rather than Cyrus's. The war between Lydia and Persia began with Croesus launching what he intended to be a preemptive strike against Persian forces in central Anatolia. The Lydian army was well equipped and experienced, having fought numerous campaigns against the Greek cities along the coast and various Anatolian tribes in the interior. Lydian cavalry was particularly formidable, and their infantry fought in the Greek style with heavy armor and long spears that had proven effective in previous conflicts. When the two armies met near the city of Tyre, the battle resulted in what ancient sources describe as a bloody stalemate, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. After suffering heavy casualties, Croesus decided to withdraw his forces to Sardis for the winter, believing that the campaigning season was over and that fighting would resume the following spring. This decision reflected standard military practice in the ancient world, where armies typically avoided major operations during the cold months when supply difficulties and harsh weather made sustained campaigns nearly impossible. However, Cyrus surprised his enemy by continuing his advance even after the first winter snows had begun to fall. The Persian army was better adapted to harsh weather conditions due to their origins on the cold Iranian plateau, and they were accustomed to the kind of rapid movement and flexible logistics that allowed them to maintain operations during seasons when other armies would have withdrawn to winter quarters. This tactical innovation gave Cyrus a significant advantage over enemies who expected him to follow conventional military practices. The Persian advance caught the Lydians completely unprepared, as Croesus had dismissed most of his soldiers for the winter and was relying on the supposedly impregnable fortifications of Sardis to protect his kingdom until spring arrived. When Cyrus appeared before the walls of the Lydian capital with his entire army, Croesus found himself trapped inside his own city with insufficient forces to mount an effective defense or to break out of the Persian siege. The Siege of Sardis lasted only 14 days according to most ancient accounts, though the exact details of how the city fell have been preserved in several different versions. The most commonly accepted story tells us that a Persian soldier observed a Lydian defender accidentally drop his helmet over the city wall and then climb down a supposedly unscalable cliff face to retrieve it. This revealed the existence of a hidden path that the Persians could use to infiltrate the city under cover of darkness. On the night chosen for the assault, a small group of Persian soldiers climbed up the cliff face and opened the gates from inside, allowing the main Persian army to enter Sardis and overwhelm the defenders before they could organize effective resistance. King Croesus was captured alive and brought before Cyrus as a prisoner, expecting to be executed according to the normal customs of ancient warfare, where defeated kings rarely survived their capture. Instead, Cyrus ordered that Croesus be treated with respect and invited him to serve as an advisor on matters relating to the governance of Anatolia and the complex relationships between the various Greek cities along the coast. This merciful treatment of a defeated enemy once again demonstrated Cyrus's understanding that building a stable empire required winning the loyalty of conquered peoples rather than simply intimidating them through displays of ruthless power. The conquest of Lydia brought the Persian Empire into direct contact with the Greek cities of the Ionian coast, which had previously been Lydian vassals. Rather than attempting to impose Persian customs on these sophisticated urban communities, Cyrus allowed them to maintain their traditional forms of government and their Greek cultural practices, while requiring only that they acknowledge Persian sovereignty and provide reasonable tribute and military service when needed. This policy of accommodation proved highly successful, as most of the Greek cities accepted Persian rule without significant resistance, recognizing that Cyrus offered them greater autonomy and lower taxes than they had enjoyed under Lydian control. The Persian conquest of Ionia also opened up new trade opportunities, connecting the Greek commercial networks with the vast markets of the Persian Empire and bringing unprecedented prosperity to cities like Miletus and Ephesus. With Lydia securely under Persian control, Cyrus turned his attention to the eastern frontiers of his empire, where various nomadic tribes posed a constant threat to the settled populations of the Iranian plateau. These campaigns were less dramatic than his conquest of established kingdoms, but they were crucial for securing the economic foundation of the Persian Empire and ensuring that the agricultural regions could develop without constant fear of raids from the steppes. The eastern campaigns also provided valuable training for the Persian army, allowing Cyrus to test new tactical formations and to integrate warriors from newly conquered territories into his military system. The Persians proved remarkably skilled at adopting useful military innovations from their enemies while maintaining the core advantages that made their army so effective, including superior mobility, excellent archery, and the ability to coordinate complex operations across vast distances. During this period, Cyrus also began the construction of a new capital city at Pasargadae in the heart of the Persian homeland. Unlike the magnificent urban centers of Mesopotamia and Anatolia with their massive walls and towering temples, Pasargadae was designed to reflect Persian values and lifestyle preferences. The city was laid out as a series of palaces and gardens connected by wide avenues and surrounded by parks where the king could hunt and hold audiences in a setting that reminded visitors of the Persian origins in the mountains and steppes. The gardens at Pasargadae were particularly famous and would later inspire the development of the Persian Paradise Gardens that became a distinctive feature of Persian royal architecture throughout the empire. These carefully designed landscapes combined flowing water, shade trees, and colorful flowers to create peaceful environments where the king could retreat from the pressures of governing his vast territories and where foreign ambassadors could be impressed by the sophistication and wealth of the Persian court. While Cyrus was consolidating his control over Anatolia and the eastern provinces, events in Mesopotamia were creating new opportunities for Persian expansion. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, which controlled much of modern Iraq and Syria, was experiencing internal political difficulties that weakened its ability to resist external threats. King Nabonidus, who ruled Babylon, had alienated many of his subjects by showing favoritism to the moon god Sin while neglecting the traditional worship of Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon. This religious controversy created serious tensions within Babylonian society as the powerful priesthood of Marduk opposed the king's religious innovations, and many ordinary citizens viewed Nabonidus's policies as a betrayal of their ancient traditions. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Nabonidus spent much of his time at the oasis city of Tama in the Arabian desert, leaving his son Belshazzar to govern Babylon as regent and creating uncertainty about the succession to the throne. Cyrus recognized that these internal divisions provided an excellent opportunity for Persian intervention in Mesopotamian affairs, and he began diplomatic preparations for what would become his most famous conquest. Rather than simply launching a military attack on Babylon, Cyrus conducted a sophisticated propaganda campaign designed to present himself as a liberator who would restore proper religious observances and bring peace and prosperity to the troubled kingdom. Persian agents were sent into Babylonian territory to establish contact with disaffected nobles and priests who might be willing to support a change of government. These envoys carried messages emphasizing Cyrus's respect for local customs and his intention to restore the traditional privileges of the Marduk priesthood. The Persian king also made it known that he would welcome the voluntary submission of Babylonian cities and would treat those who joined him willingly far better than those who resisted his advance. This diplomatic offensive proved remarkably effective, as many Babylonian cities opened their gates to Persian forces without offering any resistance. The priesthood of Marduk actively supported Cyrus's cause, viewing him as a tool for removing the heretical Nabonidus and restoring orthodox religious practices. Even many ordinary Babylonians welcomed the prospect of Persian rule, believing that Cyrus would bring the stability and prosperity that had been lacking under the distracted and unpopular Nabonidus. When Cyrus finally launched his military campaign against Babylon in 539 BCE, the actual fighting was minimal, as most of the kingdom had already effectively surrendered. The Persian army advanced down the Euphrates River, meeting little organized resistance and capturing city after city through negotiation rather than siege warfare. The speed of this advance reflected both the thoroughness of Cyrus's diplomatic preparations and the genuine unpopularity of the existing Babylonian government. The climax of the campaign came when Cyrus approached the great city of Babylon itself with its massive walls and supposedly impregnable defenses. However, instead of preparing for a lengthy siege, the Persian king found that his supporters within the city had already arranged for the gates to be opened. According to the Babylonian records, Cyrus entered Babylon peacefully and was welcomed by the population as a liberator rather than a conqueror. One of Cyrus's first acts after taking control of Babylon was to issue a famous decree that has become known to modern historians as the Cyrus Cylinder. This document, written in Akkadian and preserved on a clay cylinder, proclaimed Cyrus's intention to restore the traditional religious practices that had been disrupted under Nabonidus, and to repatriate various peoples who had been forcibly relocated by previous Babylonian kings. The cylinder specifically mentions Cyrus's decision to allow the Jewish exiles who had been deported to Babylon during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This act of religious tolerance was entirely consistent with Persian imperial policy, which typically supported local religious institutions as a means of maintaining stability and loyalty among subject populations. For the Jewish people, however, this decree marked the end of the Babylonian exile and the beginning of the Second Temple period in their history. The conquest of Babylon made Cyrus the ruler of the largest empire in human history up to that time, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India and from the Caucasus Mountains to the Arabian Desert. This vast domain included dozens of different peoples speaking hundreds of languages and practicing countless varieties of religious worship. The challenge facing Cyrus was how to govern such a diverse and far-flung empire in an age when communication was slow and transportation was difficult. The solution that Cyrus developed was to create a flexible administrative system that combined Persian political control with local cultural autonomy. Each region of the empire was governed by a Persian satrap who reported directly to the king, but who was expected to work closely with existing local leaders and institutions. This approach allowed the Persians to maintain effective control over their territories while avoiding the rebellions that typically resulted from attempts to impose cultural uniformity on diverse populations. The Persian imperial system also emphasized the importance of efficient communication and transportation networks. Cyrus began the construction of the famous royal road that would eventually connect Sardis in western Anatolia with Susa in southwestern Iran, allowing messages and travelers to cross the empire in a matter of weeks rather than months. This road system was supported by a network of way stations where official messengers could change horses and where merchants and other travelers could find food and lodging. As you listen to these gentle stories of ancient empire building, you can feel your breathing becoming slower and more regular, while the peaceful rhythm of historical narrative helps your mind release the tensions and concerns of the modern world. The Persian Empire that Cyrus created was remarkable not only for its size but also for its longevity and the relative peace and prosperity that it brought to its many subject peoples. Unlike many ancient empires that collapsed quickly after the death of their founders, the Persian system proved stable enough to endure for more than 2 centuries and flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances. The success of Cyrus's conquests reflected his understanding that true power comes not from the ability to destroy enemies but from the wisdom to transform them into allies and partners. By treating conquered peoples with respect and allowing them to maintain their cultural traditions while becoming part of a larger imperial community, Cyrus created a model of governance that would influence political thought for centuries to come. Even today, political scientists study the Persian Empire as an early example of successful multicultural administration and peaceful imperial expansion. As our gentle exploration of these ancient conquests draws toward a close, you can feel yourself becoming more and more relaxed while these quiet tales of long-ago kings and their vast empires continue to flow over you like a warm, soothing breeze. The fire beside us burns steadily, casting its peaceful light as we reflect on the remarkable transformation of a Persian prince into the ruler of the greatest empire the ancient world had yet known. In our next chapter, we will continue this peaceful journey by exploring how Cyrus's successors built upon his achievements and extended Persian power even further into the ancient world. The gentle flames continue to flicker beside us as we move peacefully forward through the ancient Persian chronicles to explore the reign of Cambyses II, who inherited the vast empire that his father Cyrus the Great had built through wisdom and conquest. You can feel yourself sinking deeper into relaxation as we follow this next chapter in Persian history, where the empire expanded even further southward into the mysterious lands of Egypt and the African territories beyond the cataracts of the Nile River. Cambyses became king of the Persian Empire in 530 BCE, following the death of his father Cyrus during a campaign against nomadic tribes in Central Asia. The transition of power occurred smoothly despite the enormous size and complexity of the empire that Cambyses inherited. This peaceful succession demonstrated the effectiveness of the administrative system that Cyrus had established and the loyalty that Persian rule had earned among the diverse populations of the empire. As the new king, Cambyses faced the challenge of proving himself worthy of his father's legacy while also establishing his own authority over the vast territories that stretched from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. The Persian nobility and the various provincial governors needed to be convinced that the young king possessed the wisdom and strength necessary to maintain the stability and prosperity that had characterized his father's reign. Cambyses understood that the best way to demonstrate his capabilities would be through a successful military campaign that would add new territories to the empire while showcasing Persian military prowess. Egypt presented itself as the most attractive target for such a campaign, as it was the only remaining major power in the ancient Near East that had not yet been incorporated into the Persian Empire. The land of the pharaohs was famous throughout the ancient world for its incredible wealth derived from the fertile Nile River Valley and its position as a crucial link in the trade routes connecting Africa with the Mediterranean and Asia. Egyptian civilization was also among the oldest and most sophisticated in the world, making its conquest a prize that would bring both material benefits and enormous prestige to the Persian crown. The Egyptian kingdom at this time was ruled by Pharaoh Amasis, who had governed the country for more than 40 years and had built Egypt into a prosperous and relatively stable state. Amasis had maintained friendly relations with the Greek cities and had welcomed Greek merchants and settlers who brought new ideas and technologies to Egypt while contributing to the kingdom's economic growth. The pharaoh had also strengthened Egypt's military forces by hiring Greek mercenaries and adopting some Greek military techniques while maintaining the traditional Egyptian administrative and religious systems. However, Egypt's apparent strength concealed some underlying weaknesses that would prove crucial during the Persian invasion. The Egyptian army, while experienced and well-equipped, was relatively small compared to the massive forces that the Persian Empire could deploy. Egypt's geographic isolation had protected it from foreign invasion for many centuries, but this same isolation meant that Egyptian military leaders had limited experience in dealing with the kind of large-scale coordinated campaigns that had made the Persian army so successful in its previous conquests. Cambyses spent several years preparing for the Egyptian campaign, carefully gathering intelligence about Egyptian defenses and building the logistical infrastructure necessary to support a major military expedition across the Sinai Desert. The Persians established supply depots along the route and negotiated agreements with Arab tribes who controlled the desert trade routes, ensuring that the Persian army would have access to water and provisions during its march toward the Nile Delta. The Persian king also conducted a sophisticated diplomatic campaign designed to isolate Egypt from potential allies and to encourage defections among Egyptian subjects who might be dissatisfied with pharaonic rule. Persian agents made contact with Egyptian nobles who had grievances against Amasis and with foreign mercenaries serving in the Egyptian army who might be persuaded to switch sides if offered better terms by the Persians. These preparations demonstrated the same careful attention to political as well as military factors that had characterized his father's successful campaigns. In 525 BCE, Cambyses launched his invasion of Egypt with an army that included not only Persian troops but also contingents from throughout the empire, including Phoenician naval forces that could support the land campaign and provide transportation for supplies and reinforcements. The diversity of this army reflected the multicultural character of the Persian Empire and the effectiveness of the imperial system in mobilizing resources from across the known world for major military operations. The Persian advance into Egypt began with a march across the Sinai Peninsula that took several weeks to complete despite the careful logistical preparations that Cambyses had made. The desert crossing was challenging for both men and animals as the army had to carry water and supplies across vast stretches of sandy terrain where temperatures could be extreme and sandstorms could disrupt movement and communication. However, the Persian forces were experienced in desert warfare from their campaigns in Central Asia, and they maintained good discipline and morale throughout the difficult journey. When the Persian army reached the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, it encountered the first Egyptian defensive positions near the city of Pelusium, which controlled one of the main routes into Egypt proper. The Egyptian forces were commanded by Psamtik III, who had recently become pharaoh following the death of his father Amasis just months before the Persian invasion. This timing was unfortunate for Egypt, as the new pharaoh had not yet had time to consolidate his authority or to complete the military preparations that might have made Egyptian resistance more effective. The Battle of Pelusium proved to be the decisive engagement of the entire campaign, as the Persian forces overwhelmed the Egyptian defenders through a combination of superior numbers, tactical flexibility, and the defection of key Egyptian units at crucial moments in the fighting. According to ancient sources, many of the Greek mercenaries serving in the Egyptian army switched sides during the battle when they realized that the Persian forces were too strong to resist and that Cambyses was offering generous terms to those who surrendered voluntarily. The defeat at Pelusium effectively ended organized Egyptian resistance to the Persian invasion, as Psamtik III was forced to retreat up the Nile toward Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt. However, the young pharaoh was unable to organize effective defenses around Memphis, and the city fell to the Persians after only a brief siege. Psamtik was captured and initially treated with respect by Cambyses, who hoped to use the former pharaoh to help legitimize Persian rule over Egypt. However, the relationship between Cambyses and Psamtik deteriorated when the Persian king learned that the former pharaoh was secretly encouraging resistance to Persian rule among the Egyptian population. According to ancient accounts, Psamtik was executed for treason, though the exact circumstances of his death remain unclear and may have been embellished by later historians who wanted to emphasize the ruthless side of Cambyses' character. With organized Egyptian resistance eliminated, Cambyses turned his attention to the complex task of governing his new conquest and integrating Egypt into the Persian Empire. Egypt presented unique challenges for Persian administrators, as it had a highly sophisticated bureaucracy and religious system that had developed over thousands of years and could not easily be replaced or modified. The Persian king needed to find ways to maintain Egyptian cooperation while ensuring that the country's wealth could be effectively mobilized for imperial purposes. Cambyses adopted a pragmatic approach to Egyptian governance that combined respect for local traditions with firm Persian political control. He allowed the Egyptian priesthood to continue their ancient religious practices and even participated in some traditional Egyptian ceremonies, including his coronation as pharaoh according to ancient Egyptian customs. This policy of religious accommodation was consistent with the general Persian approach to imperial administration and helped to reduce Egyptian resentment toward foreign rule. The Persian conquest of Egypt also brought the empire into contact with the African kingdoms south of the first cataract of the Nile, including Nubia and Ethiopia, which controlled important trade routes and gold deposits. Cambyses launched several expeditions into these southern territories, partly to secure Egypt's southern border and partly to explore the possibility of further territorial expansion that would bring additional wealth and prestige to the Persian Empire. The campaigns in Nubia were generally successful, as the Persian forces were able to establish control over the region between the first and second cataracts and to impose tribute obligations on the local rulers. However, attempts to penetrate further south into Ethiopia encountered serious difficulties, due to the harsh desert environment and the fierce resistance of the Ethiopian kingdoms, who were better adapted to the local conditions and more motivated to defend their independence. One of the most famous episodes from this period was Cambyses' alleged expedition against the Ionians, who controlled an important oasis in the western desert. According to Herodotus, Cambyses sent a large army across the desert to capture the Oracle of Ammon at the oasis of Siwa, but the entire force disappeared in a sandstorm and was never seen again. Modern historians debate whether the story has any historical basis or whether it represents a later invention designed to illustrate the dangers of excessive ambition and disrespect for divine power. While these southern campaigns were taking place, Cambyses also worked to strengthen Persian control over Egypt proper by reforming the administrative system and ensuring that Egyptian resources could be effectively mobilized for imperial purposes. The Persian king maintained the basic structure of Egyptian government but placed Persian officials in key positions and established new systems for collecting taxes and tribute that would channel Egyptian wealth toward the imperial treasury. Cambyses also invested in improving Egypt's infrastructure, including the maintenance and expansion of irrigation systems that were crucial for Egyptian agriculture and the construction of new roads and ports that would facilitate trade between Egypt and other parts of the Persian Empire. These improvements demonstrated the Persian commitment to governing Egypt as a valuable and permanent part of the empire rather than simply exploiting it as a conquered territory. The Persian occupation of Egypt also had important cultural and intellectual consequences, as it brought Persian administrators and soldiers into contact with one of the world's most ancient and sophisticated civilizations. Many Persians were impressed by Egyptian learning, particularly in areas such as medicine, astronomy, and mathematics, where Egyptian knowledge was highly advanced. This cultural exchange enriched Persian civilization and contributed to the cosmopolitan character that would become one of the defining features of the Persian Empire. Egyptian priests and scholars were also exposed to Persian and other imperial traditions, which influenced the development of Egyptian thought during the Persian period. The Persian emphasis on legal codification and administrative efficiency introduced new concepts into Egyptian government, while Persian religious ideas, particularly those derived from Zoroastrianism, had some influence on Egyptian theological thinking, though the ancient Egyptian religious system remained fundamentally unchanged. However, Cambyses' reign in Egypt was not without problems and controversies that would later be seized upon by critics of his rule. Ancient sources, particularly those written by Greek historians who were generally hostile toward Persian rule, contain numerous stories about Cambyses' allegedly erratic and sacrilegious behavior, including claims that he killed the sacred Apis bull and mocked Egyptian religious customs. Modern historians are skeptical about many of these accounts, which appear to reflect Greek prejudices rather than reliable historical evidence. What seems more certain is that Cambyses faced some resistance to his rule from elements of the Egyptian population who resented foreign domination, regardless of how tolerant and accommodating Persian policies might be. There were several minor rebellions during Cambyses' reign, though none of them posed a serious threat to Persian control, and all were suppressed relatively easily by the Persian garrison forces stationed throughout Egypt. The most serious challenge to Cambyses' authority came not from Egypt but from Persia itself, where a pretender claiming to be Smerdis, the brother of Cambyses, seized power in 522 BC while the king was still in Egypt. This usurpation forced Cambyses to abandon his African campaigns and return to Persia to deal with the threat to his throne. According to ancient sources, Cambyses died mysteriously during the journey home, possibly from an accident or illness, though some accounts suggest that he may have committed suicide when he realized the hopelessness of his situation. The death of Cambyses created a succession crisis that temporarily threatened the stability of the entire Persian Empire as various claimants competed for the throne and different provinces began to assert their independence. However, this period of confusion was relatively brief, as Darius, a member of the Persian nobility, succeeded in eliminating his rivals and establishing himself as the new king of the empire. The transition demonstrated both the underlying strength of the Persian imperial system and the importance of strong leadership in maintaining unity among the empire's diverse populations. Despite the controversies that surrounded his later years, Cambyses' conquest of Egypt represented a major achievement that significantly expanded the Persian Empire and demonstrated Persian military capabilities to the entire ancient world. The incorporation of Egypt brought enormous wealth to the imperial treasury and established Persian control over crucial trade routes connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe. Egypt would remain a Persian province for nearly 2 centuries, providing a steady source of revenue and serving as a base for further Persian expansion in the Mediterranean region. The Persian conquest of Egypt also marked the end of pharaonic independence and the beginning of a new chapter in Egyptian history, during which the ancient kingdom would be governed by a succession of foreign rulers including Persians, Greeks, and Romans. However, Egyptian civilization proved remarkably resilient and was able to maintain its distinctive character despite centuries of foreign rule. The Persian period in Egyptian history is now recognized by historians as a time of relative prosperity and cultural achievement rather than the period of oppression and decline that earlier scholars had imagined. As you continue to listen to these gentle stories of ancient conquest and empire building, you can feel yourself becoming more and more relaxed, while the peaceful rhythm of historical narrative helps your mind release the concerns and tensions of the modern world. The fire beside us continues to burn steadily, casting its warm glow as we explore the remarkable achievements of the Persian kings who built the largest and most diverse empire that the ancient world had yet known. In our next chapter, we will follow the reign of Darius the Great, who would transform the Persian Empire into an even more sophisticated and enduring political system that would serve as a model for imperial administration for centuries to come. The expansion into Egypt and Africa under Cambyses represented not just territorial conquest but also the Persian Empire's growing confidence in its ability to adapt to different environments and cultural contexts. The successful integration of Egyptian civilization into the Persian system demonstrated the flexibility and tolerance that would become hallmarks of Persian imperial governance throughout the empire's long history. These quiet achievements of ancient diplomacy and administration continue to offer lessons for modern students of international relations and cultural understanding as we drift peacefully towards sleep with these gentle tales of long-ago kings and their far-reaching empires. The flames continue their gentle dance beside us as we move deeper into our peaceful exploration of the Persian Empire and arrive at the remarkable reign of Darius I, who would become known to history as Darius the Great. You can feel your breathing becoming slower and more rhythmic as we settle into this next chapter of ancient history, where a young Persian noble transformed the vast territories inherited from Cyrus and Cambyses into the most sophisticated and well-organized empire the world had ever known. When Darius seized the Persian throne in 522 BCE following the mysterious death of Cambyses and the brief usurpation of the pretender Smerdis, he inherited an empire that was vast but not yet fully unified under a coherent system of government. The territories stretching from India to Egypt were held together primarily by military force and the personal loyalty of local governors to the Persian king, but there was no standardized administrative structure that could ensure consistent governance. Across such diverse regions and populations, Darius understood that the long-term stability and prosperity of the Persian Empire would depend on creating institutions and systems that could function effectively even when individual rulers were weak or when communication between the center and the provinces was disrupted. The young king possessed both the vision to imagine such a system and the practical skills necessary to implement comprehensive reforms that would transform the Persian Empire from a collection of conquered territories into a unified and efficiently governed state. The first challenge that Darius faced was establishing the legitimacy of his rule, since he was not a direct descendant of Cyrus the Great and had come to power through what was essentially a palace coup. To address this problem, Darius commissioned the famous Behistun inscription, which was carved into a cliff face along the royal road in multiple languages including Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. This massive monument depicted Darius receiving the blessing of the god Ahura Mazda while standing triumphant over his defeated enemies and proclaimed his divine right to rule the Persian Empire. The Behistun inscription served both as propaganda designed to legitimize Darius's reign and as a practical demonstration of the multicultural character of the Persian Empire. By presenting his message in several different languages, Darius showed his respect for the various peoples under his rule while also ensuring that his version of recent events would be widely understood throughout his territories. The inscription became one of the most important historical documents from the ancient world and provided crucial evidence for modern scholars attempting to decipher ancient Persian cuneiform writing. Once Darius had secured his position on the throne, he turned his attention to the massive task of reorganizing the imperial administration to create a system that could govern effectively across vast distances and cultural differences. The king divided the empire into 20 provinces called satrapies, each of which was governed by a satrap who served as the royal representative responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and providing military forces when required for imperial campaigns. The satrapy system represented a careful balance between central control and local autonomy that allowed the Persian Empire to maintain unity while accommodating the diverse needs and traditions of its many subject peoples. Each satrap was typically a Persian noble who had demonstrated loyalty to the crown and administrative competence, but satraps were expected to work closely with existing local institutions and to respect established customs and religious practices within their provinces. To prevent satraps from becoming too independent or developing personal power bases that might threaten imperial unity, Darius established an elaborate system of checks and balances that included regular inspections by royal officials known as the eyes and ears of the king. These inspectors traveled throughout the empire, monitoring the performance of provincial governors and reporting directly to the king about conditions in distant territories. The system ensured that Darius remained well informed about developments throughout his realm and could take corrective action when problems arose. The Persian Empire under Darius was also remarkable for its sophisticated approach to taxation and economic policy, which aimed to promote prosperity throughout the empire while generating sufficient revenue to support the imperial government and military. Rather than simply extracting tribute from conquered territories as most ancient empires did, the Persians developed a more nuanced system that took into account the different economic conditions and capabilities of various regions. Each satrapy was assigned a specific annual tribute obligation that was calculated based on the province's population, agricultural productivity, and commercial activity. However, the method of collecting this tribute was left largely to local authorities, who could choose whether to raise revenue through taxes on land, trade, or other economic activities. This flexibility allowed different regions to contribute to the imperial treasury in ways that were compatible with their traditional economic systems and cultural practices. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency throughout much of the empire empire facilitated trade and commerce while also making tax collection more efficient and equitable. Darius introduced the gold daric, which became one of the most widely accepted coins in the ancient world and helped to create an integrated imperial economy that connected markets from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. The development of standardized currency also made it easier for the imperial government to pay its soldiers and officials and to finance major construction projects. Speaking of construction projects, Darius initiated some of the most ambitious building programs in ancient history, including the creation of the magnificent ceremonial capital at Persepolis, which would serve as the primary residence of Persian kings for the next 2 centuries. Persepolis was designed to showcase the wealth, power, and cultural sophistication of the Persian Empire, while also serving practical functions as an administrative center and a venue for the elaborate ceremonies that reinforced the authority of the Persian monarchy. The construction of Persepolis required enormous resources and the coordination of craftsmen and laborers from throughout the empire, bringing together artistic traditions from dozens of different cultures to create a unique architectural synthesis that reflected the multicultural character of Persian civilization. The great audience halls and throne rooms of Persepolis were decorated with relief sculptures depicting representatives of all the empire's provinces, bringing tribute to the Persian king and demonstrating their loyalty to the imperial system. These artistic representations served both decorative and political purposes, as they reminded visitors of the vast extent of Persian power while also celebrating the diversity and prosperity of the empire's many subject peoples. Foreign ambassadors who came to Persepolis for audiences with the king could see visual evidence of the empire's wealth and stability, while also observing that other peoples had found it beneficial to accept Persian rule and maintain peaceful relations with the imperial government. Darius also completed and extended the royal road system that had been begun under his predecessors, creating an integrated network of highways that connected the major cities of the empire and facilitated rapid communication between the center and the provinces. The royal road stretched for over 1,500 miles from Sardis in western Anatolia to Susa in southwestern Iran, and was maintained by a professional postal service that could deliver messages across the empire in a matter of weeks rather than months. This communication network was crucial for effective imperial administration, as it allowed the king to stay informed about developments in distant provinces and to coordinate policy across the vast territories under Persian control. The royal road also facilitated trade and cultural exchange by providing safe and reliable routes for merchants, travelers, and pilgrims who carried goods, ideas, and technologies throughout the empire, and helped to create the cosmopolitan civilization that characterized the Persian imperial period. The postal system that operated along the royal road was particularly sophisticated and efficient, featuring relay stations where mounted messengers could change horses and rest before continuing their journeys. According to ancient sources, these royal messengers were so dedicated to their duties that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness could prevent them from completing their appointed rounds. This famous description would later inspire the unofficial motto of the modern United States Postal Service, demonstrating the lasting influence of Persian administrative innovations. Darius also reformed the imperial military to create a more professional and better organized fighting force that could respond effectively to threats on multiple frontiers, while also maintaining internal security throughout the empire. The Persian army under Darius combined the traditional strengths of Persian cavalry and archery with new tactical formations and siege techniques that had been learned from contact with Greek, Egyptian, and other military traditions. The elite unit known as the Immortals served as the core of the imperial army and consisted of exactly 10,000 Persian and Median soldiers who were recruited from the nobility and trained to the highest standards of military professionalism. The Immortals received the best equipment and training available and served as both the king's personal guard and as shock troops who could be deployed wherever the most difficult fighting was expected. The unit was called the Immortals because whenever a soldier was killed or disabled, he was immediately replaced so that the unit always maintained its full strength of 10,000 men. In addition to the Immortals, the Persian army included contingents from throughout the empire, each contributing their distinctive military specialties to create a diverse and flexible fighting force. Scythian horse archers provided mobile firepower, while heavily armored Greek hoplites served as infantry shock troops, and Phoenician sailors operated the Imperial Navy that controlled the eastern Mediterranean and supported land campaigns with supplies and transportation. This multicultural approach to military organization reflected the broader Persian philosophy of imperial governance, which emphasized the benefits of diversity and the importance of utilizing the different talents and resources available throughout the empire. Rather than attempting to create a uniform military system based solely on Persian traditions, Darius and his successors developed an integrated approach that combined the best elements from many different military cultures to create an imperial army that was more effective than any of its individual components. The legal system under Darius also reflected this pragmatic and inclusive approach to imperial governance, as the Persian king generally allowed local communities to maintain their traditional laws and customs while establishing imperial courts to handle disputes that crossed provincial boundaries or involved imperial interests. This dual legal system provided stability and continuity for local populations while ensuring that the imperial government could protect its interests and maintain order throughout the empire. Persian law emphasized the importance of truthfulness and justice, principles that were deeply rooted in Persian religious and cultural traditions. The concept of truth, or arta, was central to Persian ethics and was believed to be one of the fundamental forces governing the universe. Kings were expected to be defenders of truth and justice, and their legitimacy depended partly on their ability to maintain fair and consistent legal procedures throughout their territories. The Persian legal system also included provisions for appeals and reviews that allowed individuals who felt they had been treated unfairly by local authorities to seek justice from higher courts, including ultimately the king himself. This system of legal appeals helped to maintain imperial unity by ensuring that all subjects of the empire had access to Persian justice, while also providing a mechanism for identifying and correcting abuses by local officials. Religious policy under Darius continued the tradition of tolerance and accommodation that had been established by Cyrus the Great, though Darius himself appears to have been more personally committed to Zoroastrian beliefs and practices than his predecessors had been. The king supported the construction and maintenance of fire temples throughout the empire, while also continuing to patronize local religious institutions and to participate in traditional ceremonies when politically appropriate. This balanced approach to religious policy helped to maintain stability throughout the empire by avoiding the religious conflicts that had disrupted other ancient states. Subject peoples were free to worship their traditional gods and to maintain their customary religious practices, as long as they also acknowledged the authority of the Persian king and participated in imperial ceremonies when required. This religious tolerance was both a practical necessity for governing a diverse empire and a reflection of Persian beliefs about the importance of allowing different peoples to follow their own paths toward truth and righteousness. The economic prosperity that characterized the Persian Empire under Darius was supported by an extensive network of trade routes that connected markets throughout the known world and facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies across vast distances. Persian merchants carried silk and spices from China and India to Mediterranean ports, while Greek wine and pottery moved eastward to markets in Central Asia and beyond. This commercial activity generated enormous wealth for the imperial treasury through customs duties and taxes, while also promoting cultural exchange and technological innovation. The Persian Empire's position at the crossroads of the ancient world made it a natural center for international trade and diplomacy, as merchants, ambassadors, and travelers from many different civilizations passed through Persian territories on their way to distant destinations. The cosmopolitan atmosphere of Persian cities attracted scholars, artists, and craftsmen from throughout the known world who contributed to the development of a sophisticated imperial culture that combined elements from many different traditions. Persian craftsmanship during the reign of Darius achieved remarkable levels of sophistication and artistry as royal workshops produced luxury goods that were admired throughout the ancient world. Persian carpets, metalwork, and jewelry became symbols of wealth and refinement, while Persian architectural techniques influenced building styles from Egypt to India. The artistic achievements of the Persian Empire reflected both the wealth generated by successful imperial administration and the cultural cross-fertilization that resulted from bringing together talented individuals from many different backgrounds. The administrative innovations introduced by Darius proved remarkably durable and continued to influence governmental practices long after the fall of the Persian Empire. The satrapy system was later adopted and modified by Alexander the Great and his successors, while elements of Persian administrative practice influenced the development of Roman provincial government and medieval Islamic administration. The Persian emphasis on tolerance, diversity, and local autonomy within an imperial framework provided a model for multi-ethnic governance that remains relevant for modern political scientists and administrators. The reign of Darius also marked the beginning of a golden age of Persian culture during which the empire reached its peak in terms of wealth, power, and cultural achievement. The stability and prosperity that resulted from effective administration created conditions that allowed art, literature, and learning to flourish, while the empire's extensive trade networks facilitated the exchange of ideas and innovations that enriched Persian civilization and contributed to human knowledge more generally. Under Darius, the Persian Empire became not just a military and political force, but also a center of learning and cultural creativity that attracted scholars and artists from throughout the known world. The royal libraries at Persepolis and other imperial cities contained works in dozens of different languages, while Persian scholars made important contributions to astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and other fields of knowledge. This intellectual flowering reflected the empire's commitment to learning from the wisdom of all its subject peoples rather than imposing a single cultural model throughout its territories. The peaceful coexistence of different religious and cultural traditions within the Persian Empire also created opportunities for theological and philosophical exchange that influenced the development of both Persian and non-Persian thought. Zoroastrian concepts of cosmic dualism and ethical monotheism interacted with Greek philosophical ideas, Egyptian religious traditions, and Indian spiritual practices to create new syntheses that would influence religious and intellectual development for centuries to come. As you continue to listen to these gentle accounts of ancient imperial administration, you can feel yourself becoming more and more relaxed, while the steady rhythm of historical narrative helps your mind release the concerns and tensions of the modern world. The fire beside us continues to burn peacefully, casting its warm glow as we explore the remarkable achievements of Darius the Great, who transformed the Persian Empire into a sophisticated and enduring political system that would serve as a model for imperial governance for generations to come. The legacy of Darius's administrative reforms extended far beyond the boundaries of the Persian Empire itself, as his innovations in government communication and economic policy influenced the development of later empires and political systems throughout the ancient and medieval worlds. The Persian emphasis on efficient administration, cultural tolerance, and economic prosperity created a template for successful imperial governance that would be studied and emulated by rulers and administrators for centuries after the fall of Persepolis. These quiet achievements of ancient statecraft continue to offer valuable lessons for modern students of politics and administration as we drift peacefully towards sleep with these gentle tales of long-ago kings and their far-reaching innovations in the art of governing diverse and distant populations. As the gentle flames continue to flicker beside us, we turn our peaceful attention to a new chapter in the story of the Persian Empire, when the vast territories governed by Darius the Great came into conflict with the independent Greek city-states across the Aegean Sea. You can feel yourself settling even deeper into relaxation as we explore these ancient events that would shape the relationship between East and West for centuries to come, while the soothing rhythm of historical narrative helps your mind drift away from the concerns of the modern world. The conflict between Persia and Greece began not as a grand clash between civilizations, but rather as a series of smaller disputes and misunderstandings that gradually escalated into larger confrontations. The Persian Empire under Darius had grown to encompass the Greek cities along the coast of Asia Minor, including wealthy and sophisticated communities like Miletus, Ephesus, and Halicarnassus that had been incorporated into the empire during the reign of Cyrus the Great, when he conquered the Lydian kingdom. These Ionian Greek cities, as they were called, had initially accepted Persian rule without significant resistance and had prospered under the tolerant administrative system that allowed them to maintain their traditional forms of government and cultural practices. The Persians required tribute and military service from their Greek subjects, but they generally interfered very little in local affairs and allowed the cities to continue their profitable trade relationships throughout the Mediterranean world. However, over time tensions began to develop between the Persian authorities and some elements of the Greek population, who felt that foreign rule was incompatible with their traditions of political independence and self-governance. The Greeks had a long history of city-state autonomy, and many citizens found it difficult to accept the concept of submission to a distant monarch, even when that submission brought material benefits and protection from external threats. The situation was complicated by the complex relationships between the Ionian cities and their fellow Greeks across the Aegean Sea, particularly Athens, which had historical and cultural ties to many of the Asian Greek communities. Athenian merchants maintained extensive trade connections with the Ionian cities, while Athenian intellectuals and artists frequently traveled to Asia Minor, where they could find patronage and opportunities for cultural exchange with the sophisticated urban populations there. These connections meant that political developments in Ionia were closely watched in Athens and other mainland Greek cities, where public opinion was generally sympathetic to any movement that promised to restore Greek independence in Asia Minor. However, the mainland Greeks were also aware that direct confrontation with the Persian Empire would be extremely dangerous, given the vast resources and military power that Darius could deploy against his enemies. The immediate cause of what became known as the Ionian Revolt was a dispute involving the city of Naxos in the Cyclades Islands, where competing political factions sought support from different external powers. The Persian satrap of Lydia became involved in this local conflict and requested military assistance from some of the Ionian cities to help install a pro-Persian government on Naxos. The expedition failed and resulted in significant financial losses for the participating cities, while also exposing the extent to which Persian authorities were willing to interfere in Greek political affairs. Artaxerxes, the tyrant of Miletus, who had been one of the leaders of the failed Naxos expedition, found himself in serious political difficulty as a result of the failure, and began to consider whether rebellion against Persian rule might offer a way to restore his position and avoid punishment from the Persian authorities. Artaxerxes understood that Miletus alone could not successfully challenge Persian power, but he believed that a coordinated revolt involving all the Ionian cities might have a chance of success, especially if it could gain support from the mainland Greek states. In 499 BCE, Artaxerxes formally announced his rebellion against Persian rule and began a diplomatic campaign designed to build a coalition of Greek cities willing to support the cause of Ionian independence. His agents traveled throughout the Greek world seeking military and financial assistance for the revolt, while also attempting to coordinate the activities of anti-Persian elements in the various Ionian communities. The response to these appeals was mixed, as many Greek cities were reluctant to become involved in what appeared to be a hopeless conflict with the mighty Persian Empire. Sparta, the most powerful military state in Greece, declined to provide assistance, partly because of the great distance involved and partly because the Spartan government was generally conservative and reluctant to become involved in overseas adventures that might distract from domestic priorities. However, Athens decided to provide limited support for the Ionian revolt, sending 20 ships and a small contingent of soldiers to assist in the fight against Persian rule. This Athenian intervention was motivated partly by sympathy for their fellow Greeks and partly by strategic considerations, since Athenian leaders recognized that successful Persian control over all the Greek cities in Asia Minor might eventually threaten Athenian commercial interests and political independence. The city of Eretria on the island of Euboea also agreed to support the revolt, contributing 5 ships to the rebel cause. While this assistance was relatively modest in military terms, it had enormous political significance because it represented direct intervention by mainland Greek states in Persian imperial affairs and constituted a clear challenge to Persian authority that Darius could not ignore without appearing weak to his other subjects. The Ionian rebels achieved some initial successes, including the capture and burning of Sardis, the administrative capital of the Persian province of Lydia. However, the rebels were unable to take the citadel of Sardis, where the Persian garrison held out until relief forces arrived, and the burning of the city included the destruction of a temple sacred to the goddess Cybele, which greatly offended local religious sensibilities and reduced support for the rebel cause among the non-Greek population of the region. The Persian response to the revolt was initially hampered by the need to mobilize forces from distant provinces and to coordinate a complex military campaign across difficult terrain. However, once the imperial war machine began to function effectively, the rebels found themselves facing overwhelming opposition as Persian armies advanced from multiple directions, while the Persian navy began to isolate the rebel cities from potential sources of outside support. The revolt continued for several years with varying fortunes, as different cities fell to Persian forces or managed to maintain their independence through successful defense or favorable local conditions. However, the fundamental disparity in resources between the Persian Empire and the rebel cities meant that the outcome was never really in doubt once Darius committed sufficient forces to the suppression of the rebellion. The decisive moment came in 494 BCE with the naval battle of Lade near Miletus, where the combined Ionian fleet was defeated by Persian naval forces that included contingents from Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Egypt. The defeat at Lade effectively ended any hope of success for the rebellion, as it left the individual cities isolated and vulnerable to siege, while also demonstrating that the rebels could not match Persian naval power even when all their forces were combined. Following the naval defeat, Miletus itself was captured after a prolonged siege, and the city was severely punished for its role in leading the rebellion. Many of the inhabitants were killed or enslaved, while others were deported to distant parts of the Persian Empire. The Temple of Apollo at Didyma, which was one of the most important religious sites in the Greek world, was burned and its treasures were carried off to Persia as trophies of victory. The suppression of the Ionian revolt restored Persian control over the Greek cities of Asia Minor, but it also created new tensions and resentments that would influence future relations between Persians and Greeks. The harsh treatment of Miletus and other rebel cities was seen by many Greeks as evidence that Persian rule was fundamentally incompatible with Greek values and traditions, while the involvement of Athens and Eretria in supporting the revolt had created a direct conflict between Persia and the mainland Greek states. From Darius's perspective, the Athenian and Eretrian intervention in the Ionian revolt represented an intolerable interference in Persian imperial affairs that required appropriate punishment to maintain the prestige and authority of the Persian crown. The king could not allow foreign powers to support rebellions within his empire without responding forcefully, since such tolerance would encourage other subject peoples to seek outside assistance for their own independence movements. The Persian king therefore began planning a punitive expedition against Athens and Eretria that would demonstrate Persian power, while also serving as a warning to other potential enemies who might consider challenging Persian authority. However, Darius understood that such an expedition would need to be carefully planned and executed, since failure would damage Persian prestige, while success would require overcoming significant logistical challenges involved in transporting and supplying a large army across the Aegean Sea. The Persian military preparations for the Greek expedition took several years to complete, as the empire needed to assemble naval forces from throughout its Mediterranean provinces while also gathering troops and supplies for what would be a complex amphibious operation. The Persian navy was built around Phoenician and Egyptian squadrons that provided the core of experienced sailors and warships, while contingents from Cyprus and other maritime provinces added additional vessels and crews. The army designated for the Greek expedition included not only Persian and Median troops, but also contingents from throughout the empire, reflecting the multicultural character of Persian military organization. Cavalry units from Central Asia were combined with infantry from Mesopotamia and siege specialists from various regions to create a diverse force that could adapt to different tactical situations and terrain conditions. Command of the expedition was given to Artaxerxes, the nephew of Darius, and Datis, a Median general who had extensive experience in amphibious operations. This joint command structure reflected Persian practice of balancing different ethnic and regional interests, while also ensuring that multiple perspectives were represented in strategic decision-making. The two commanders were instructed to capture Athens and Eretria and to bring their populations back to Persia as slaves, while also establishing Persian control over as much of mainland Greece as possible. The Persian fleet departed from Cilicia in 490 BCE and sailed across the Aegean Sea, making stops at various islands to gather supplies and demonstrate Persian naval power to potential allies or enemies. The expedition first attacked Naxos, which had been the original cause of the conflict leading to the Ionian revolt, and the Persians captured the island and enslaved its population as an example of what would happen to communities that resisted Persian authority. From Naxos, the Persian fleet sailed to Eretria on Euboea, where the city was placed under siege. The Eretrians had requested assistance from Athens, but the Athenians were reluctant to commit their forces so far from home when they expected that their own city would soon be under attack. After 6 days of fighting, Eretria was betrayed by some of its own citizens and fell to the Persians, who burned the city and enslaved the surviving population in accordance with their instructions from Darius. With Eretria eliminated, the Persian expedition turned toward Attica, where Athens lay waiting for the expected attack. The Persian commanders chose to land their forces at Marathon, a coastal plain about 25 miles northeast of Athens that offered good terrain for deploying cavalry and establishing a secure base for operations against the Athenian city. The choice of Marathon also had psychological significance as it was relatively close to Athens and would allow the Athenians to see smoke from Persian campfires while contemplating the fate that awaited them. The Athenian response to the Persian landing was swift and decisive as the city mobilized its citizen army and marched to Marathon to confront the invaders before they could advance toward Athens itself. The Athenian army was commanded by 10 elected generals, including Miltiades, who had personal experience with Persian military methods and had been arguing for an aggressive response to the Persian threat. The Athenians also sent a messenger to Sparta requesting immediate military assistance, but the Spartans replied that religious obligations prevented them from marching until after the full moon, which would delay their arrival for several days. This Spartan response reflected both genuine religious concerns and political calculations about the wisdom of becoming deeply involved in Athenian conflicts with Persia. However, the small city of Plataea, which had a military alliance with Athens, did send its entire army to support the Athenian cause. The Plataean contingent was small, numbering perhaps 1,000 men, but their presence demonstrated that Athens was not entirely isolated and provided valuable psychological support for the Athenian troops who were about to face the supposedly invincible Persian army. The two armies faced each other across the plain of Marathon for several days as both sides considered their options and waited for favorable conditions to begin the battle. The Persian commanders were confident that their superior numbers and cavalry would eventually force the Greeks to retreat or surrender, while the Athenian generals debated whether to attack immediately or wait for Spartan reinforcements that might never arrive. The decision to attack was finally made when the Athenians received intelligence suggesting that some elements in Athens were prepared to betray the city to the Persians if the siege continued much longer. Miltiades convinced his fellow generals that immediate action was necessary to prevent both military defeat and political collapse, and the Athenian army was ordered to advance against the Persian positions. The Battle of Marathon began at dawn on a day in late September 490 BCE when the Athenian and Plataean forces charged across the plain toward the Persian lines. The Greek formation was unusual in that it was strengthened on both wings, while the center was deliberately weakened in order to maximize the impact of the flanking attacks that would hopefully envelop the Persian army. The Persian forces initially succeeded in breaking through the weakened Greek center, but they found themselves surrounded when the stronger Greek wings completed their advance and began attacking the Persian flanks and rear. Many Persian soldiers became trapped between the Greek forces and the sea, while others fled in disorder toward their ships, leaving behind weapons, equipment, and wounded comrades. The battle resulted in a complete Greek victory, with Persian casualties estimated at over 6,000 killed, while Greek losses were reportedly fewer than 200 men. The Persian expedition was forced to abandon its plans for attacking Athens directly and instead sailed around Cape Sunium, hoping to reach Athens before the victorious Greek army could return to defend the city. However, the Athenians had anticipated this possibility, and their army made a forced march back to Athens, arriving just in time to prevent any Persian attempt to land near the city. When the Persian fleet appeared off the Athenian coast and saw that the city was defended, they abandoned their mission and sailed back to Asia Minor, having failed to achieve any of their primary objectives. The news of the Marathon victory spread rapidly throughout the Greek world, where it was received with amazement and celebration as proof that the supposedly invincible Persian army could be defeated by determined Greek resistance. The victory also had important political consequences within Athens, where it strengthened democratic institutions and increased confidence in the city's ability to maintain its independence against foreign threats. For the Persian Empire, the defeat at Marathon was a serious blow to imperial prestige that required a response to maintain the credibility of Persian power. Darius immediately began planning a much larger expedition that would involve the full resources of the empire and would be designed to conquer all of Greece rather than simply punishing Athens and Eretria for their support of the Ionian Revolt. However, the preparations for this larger campaign were delayed by rebellions in Egypt and Babylon that required Darius to divert military resources to suppress domestic threats before he could resume operations against Greece. These delays proved crucial as they gave the Greek cities time to prepare for the inevitable Persian return, while also allowing political developments within Greece that would make successful Persian conquest much more difficult. The Marathon campaign also revealed some important limitations of Persian military power, particularly in amphibious operations where the empire's usual advantages in numbers and logistics were reduced by the difficulties of maintaining supply lines across water. The Persian army had proven vulnerable to determined Greek resistance when it could not deploy its full strength or utilize its cavalry effectively in the confined space of the Marathon battlefield. As you listen to these gentle accounts of ancient warfare and diplomacy, you can feel your breathing becoming even slower and more peaceful, while the steady rhythm of historical narrative helps your mind release the tensions and concerns of the modern world. The fire beside us continues to burn quietly, casting its warm glow as we explore these momentous events that would shape the relationship between East and West for generations to come. The aftermath of Marathon marked the beginning of a new phase in the relationship between the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states, as both sides began to prepare for what they recognized would be a much larger and more decisive confrontation. Darius spent the remaining years of his reign gathering resources and planning strategies for a massive invasion that would finally bring Greece under Persian control, while the Greeks used the time to strengthen their defenses and build alliances that might allow them to resist the coming Persian assault. These preparations on both sides set the stage for the great invasion that would come under Darius's successor Xerxes, and would result in some of the most famous battles in ancient history. As we continue our peaceful journey through these ancient events, you can feel yourself becoming more and more relaxed, while these quiet tales of long-ago conflicts help your mind drift gently toward the rest and restoration that sleep provides. The gentle flames continue their quiet dance beside us as we move deeper into our peaceful exploration of Persian history and come to the reign of Xerxes I, who inherited from his father Darius not only the vast Persian Empire but also the unfinished business of conquering Greece. You can feel yourself settling into an even deeper state of relaxation as we follow this ancient king's massive invasion of Europe, while the soothing rhythm of these historical tales helps your mind drift away from all the concerns and tensions of the modern world. Xerxes became king of the Persian Empire in 486 BCE following the death of his father Darius, who had spent the final years of his reign planning an enormous military expedition to punish the Greeks for their victory at Marathon and to bring all of Europe under Persian control. The new king inherited not only his father's ambitions but also the vast resources and sophisticated administrative system that would make possible the largest military operation the ancient world had ever seen. Unlike his predecessors who had come to the throne through conquest or political maneuvering, Xerxes was the legitimate heir who had been carefully prepared for his role as ruler of the Persian Empire. He had received an excellent education in administration, military affairs, and diplomacy, while also gaining practical experience in governing various provinces of the empire under his father's supervision. This preparation would prove valuable as Xerxes faced the enormous challenges involved in organizing and leading the greatest invasion force in ancient history. The young king's first priority was to complete the suppression of rebellions in Egypt and Babylon that had delayed his father's plans for the Greek expedition. These domestic conflicts required careful handling as they involved some of the wealthiest and most important provinces of the empire whose loyalty was crucial for the long-term stability of Persian rule. Xerxes managed to restore order in both regions through a combination of military force and diplomatic concessions that demonstrated his ability to balance firmness with pragmatism. With internal security restored, Xerxes turned his attention to the massive preparations required for the invasion of Greece, which would involve transporting and supplying hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the waters of the Hellespont and through the difficult terrain of Thrace and Macedonia. The logistical challenges were enormous as the Persian army would need to maintain its supply lines across vast distances while operating in territory that was often hostile and where local resources might be insufficient to support such a large force. The Persian preparations began with diplomatic efforts to secure the cooperation or neutrality of various peoples and city-states along the intended route of invasion. Persian ambassadors were sent to Thrace, Macedonia, and northern Greece seeking agreements that would allow the Persian army to pass through their territories without opposition, while also requesting contributions of troops, supplies, and transportation for the imperial forces. Many of these diplomatic initiatives were successful as local rulers recognized that resistance to the Persian Empire was likely to be futile and that cooperation might bring benefits in terms of trade opportunities and political autonomy. The Kingdom of Macedonia under King Alexander I agreed to provide support for the Persian expedition, while many of the Thracian tribes also accepted Persian authority and agreed to contribute warriors to the invasion force. However, some Greek city-states, particularly Athens and Sparta, rejected Persian diplomatic overtures and began their own preparations for what they recognized would be a life-or-death struggle for Greek independence. The Athenians used the years of Persian preparation to strengthen their navy, while the Spartans worked to build a coalition of Greek cities willing to resist the Persian invasion through coordinated military action. The physical preparations for the invasion were as impressive as the diplomatic efforts, as Xerxes ordered the construction of bridges across the Hellespont to allow his army to cross from Asia into Europe without the delays and risks that would be involved in ferrying such a large force across the water. The bridge construction was a remarkable engineering achievement that involved connecting hundreds of ships with cables and planks to create a roadway nearly a mile long that could support the passage of the entire Persian army with its cavalry baggage train and siege equipment. Persian engineers also dug a canal across the narrow neck of the Athos Peninsula to allow the Persian fleet to avoid the dangerous waters around Mount Athos, where a previous Persian naval expedition had been wrecked during the reign of Darius. This canal was approximately a mile and a half long and took 3 years to complete, requiring the labor of thousands of workers who removed enormous quantities of earth and rock to create a passage deep enough for Persian warships. The Persian army that assembled for the Greek invasion was truly multinational in character, including contingents from every province of the empire and representing dozens of different ethnic groups, languages, and military traditions. The core of the force consisted of Persian and Median troops, including the elite immortals who served as the king's personal guard, but the majority of the army was composed of soldiers from the various subject peoples of the empire. Herodotus provides a famous catalog of the various contingents in Xerxes' army, describing the distinctive weapons, armor, and fighting styles of warriors from regions as diverse as India, Ethiopia, Arabia, and Scythia. While some of these descriptions may be exaggerated or romanticized, they give us a sense of the truly cosmopolitan character of the Persian military and the empire's ability to mobilize resources from across the known world for major campaigns. The size of Xerxes' invasion force has been a subject of debate among historians since ancient times, as the numbers provided by Greek sources are almost certainly inflated for dramatic effect. Herodotus claims that the Persian army numbered over 1,700,000 men, while the fleet included more than 1,200 warships and 3,000 supply vessels. Modern scholars generally believe that these figures are greatly exaggerated, and that the actual Persian forces probably numbered several hundred thousand troops supported by a fleet of perhaps 600 or 700 ships. Even with more conservative estimates, the Persian invasion force was enormous by ancient standards and represented the largest military expedition ever attempted up to that time. The logistical requirements for feeding and supplying such a massive army were staggering and required advanced planning and preparation on a scale that had never been undertaken before. Supply depots were established along the route of march, while arrangements were made for obtaining provisions from local sources and for maintaining communication lines back to the Persian homeland. In the spring of 480 BCE, Xerxes led his vast army across the bridges over the Hellespont in a ceremony that was designed to demonstrate Persian power and divine favor while also providing practical experience in managing the complex movements of such a large force. According to ancient accounts, the crossing took 7 days and 7 nights to complete, as the entire army with its cavalry pack animals and equipment passed from Asia into Europe. The Persian advance through Thrace and Macedonia proceeded smoothly, as most of the local populations had already agreed to submit to Persian authority and provided guide supplies and additional troops for the invasion force. The sheer size of the Persian army was sufficient to discourage most potential opposition, while the multicultural character of the force demonstrated the global reach of Persian power and the futility of resistance by individual city-states or tribal groups. As the Persian army approached northern Greece, the Greek city-states that had decided to resist the invasion began to coordinate their defensive preparations. A congress of Greek cities met at the Isthmus of Corinth to plan strategy and allocate responsibilities for the defense of Greek independence. The Congress decided to make an initial stand at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where the mountainous terrain would limit the Persian ability to deploy their superior numbers effectively. The Greek strategy at Thermopylae was based on the recognition that they could not match Persian numbers in open battle, but might be able to hold strategic positions where terrain advantages would offset Persian numerical superiority. The pass at Thermopylae was particularly suitable for this purpose, as it was so narrow that only a small number of soldiers could fight at one time, making Persian numbers largely irrelevant as long as the Greeks could maintain their position. Command of the Greek forces at Thermopylae was given to King Leonidas of Sparta, who led a force of about 7,000 men, including 300 Spartan warriors who would become legendary for their heroic sacrifice. The choice of Leonidas reflected both Spartan military reputation and the political necessity of having the coalition led by representatives of the most powerful Greek military state. When Xerxes arrived at Thermopylae with his enormous army, he was reportedly amazed to discover that such a small Greek force was prepared to challenge the might of the Persian Empire. The Persian king sent messengers to Leonidas demanding that the Greeks surrender their weapons and submit to Persian authority, but the Spartan king famously replied that the Persians could come and take them if they were able. The battle at Thermopylae began with Persian attempts to break through the Greek position using conventional infantry attacks that were repeatedly repulsed by the heavily armored Greek hoplites fighting in close formation. The narrow confines of the pass prevented the Persians from bringing their numerical superiority to bear, while the Greek bronze armor and long spears proved highly effective against Persian weapons and tactics. For 2 days the battle continued, with waves of Persian attacks being thrown back by the steadfast Greek defense. Xerxes committed his elite immortals to the assault, but even these finest Persian troops were unable to break through the Greek lines. The Persian cavalry, which had been so effective in previous campaigns, was essentially useless in the confined space of the mountain pass, while Persian archers found their arrows largely ineffective against Greek armor and shields. The deadlock at Thermopylae was finally broken when a local Greek named Ephialtes showed the Persians a mountain path that allowed them to attack the Greek position from behind. This betrayal made the Greek position untenable, as they would be surrounded and attacked from both front and rear once the Persian flanking force completed its movement through the mountains. When Leonidas learned of the Persian flanking maneuver, he dismissed most of his allies and prepared to make a final stand with his 300 Spartans and a small number of other Greek volunteers who chose to remain and fight to the death rather than retreat. This decision reflected both practical military considerations and the Spartan code of honor, which forbade retreat in the face of the enemy regardless of the odds. The final phase of the battle at Thermopylae saw the Greeks fighting desperately against overwhelming odds as they were attacked from multiple directions by vastly superior Persian forces. The Spartans and their allies fought with extraordinary courage and skill, inflicting heavy casualties on their enemies before finally being overwhelmed and killed to the last man. King Leonidas himself fell in the fighting, and his body was recovered by the Persians, who treated it with respect in recognition of his bravery. The Persian victory at Thermopylae opened the road to central Greece and allowed Xerxes to advance toward Athens, while his fleet moved south along the coast to support the land campaign. However, the heroic resistance of Leonidas and his men had served important strategic and psychological purposes by delaying the Persian advance and demonstrating that Greek soldiers could fight effectively against Persian forces when properly positioned and motivated. The news of Thermopylae spread rapidly throughout the Greek world, where it was received with both grief for the fallen heroes and determination to continue the struggle for Greek independence. The sacrifice of the 300 Spartans became a powerful symbol of Greek resistance and helped to maintain morale during the difficult period when Persian forces were overrunning much of northern and central Greece. Meanwhile, the Persian fleet was advancing along the Greek coast toward Athens while engaging in several naval skirmishes with Greek ships that were attempting to slow the Persian advance and gather intelligence about enemy intentions and capabilities. The Persian navy included ships from throughout the empire, with Phoenician vessels providing the core of experienced sailors and warships, while Egyptian Cypriot and Ionian contingents added additional strength. The Greek naval strategy was coordinated by Themistocles, the Athenian leader, who had convinced his fellow citizens to invest in building a powerful fleet that could challenge Persian naval supremacy. The Greek navy was smaller than the Persian fleet, but it was composed primarily of well-trained crews from the major maritime cities of Greece, who had extensive experience in naval warfare and intimate knowledge of local waters and weather conditions. As the Persian army advanced into central Greece, many Greek cities either surrendered without resistance or were abandoned by their populations, who fled southward seeking safety behind the defensive lines that the Greek coalition was attempting to establish. Athens itself was evacuated except for a small garrison that attempted to defend the Acropolis, but was eventually overwhelmed by Persian assault forces. The capture and burning of Athens represented a major propaganda victory for Xerxes, as he had finally achieved his father's goal of punishing the city that had supported the Ionian revolt and defeated Persian forces at Marathon. However, the Persian king found that his victory was somewhat hollow, since most of the Athenian population had escaped and the city's wealth had been removed or hidden before the Persian arrival. The decisive confrontation between the Persian and Greek fleets took place in the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the Attic mainland, where Themistocles had positioned the Greek navy in a carefully chosen defensive position. The Greek strategy was based on the belief that the confined waters would limit Persian numerical advantages while allowing Greek ships to utilize their superior seamanship and knowledge of local conditions. Xerxes positioned himself on a hill overlooking the straits where he could observe the battle and direct the movements of his fleet while also demonstrating his personal involvement in the crucial engagement. The Persian king expected that his superior numbers would quickly overwhelm the Greek resistance and complete the conquest of Greece by eliminating the last significant Greek military force. The Battle of Salamis began at dawn when the Persian fleet moved into the straits expecting to trap and destroy the Greek navy in the confined waters. However, Themistocles had anticipated this Persian strategy and had positioned his ships to take advantage of the morning winds and currents that would favor Greek tactical formations while creating difficulties for the larger and less maneuverable Persian vessels. As the battle developed, the Persian fleet found itself crowded together in the narrow straits where their ships began to interfere with each other's movements while coming under attack from Greek vessels that could maneuver more effectively in the confined space. The heavier Persian ships proved vulnerable to ramming attacks by the more agile Greek triremes, while Persian attempts to use their numerical superiority were frustrated by the tactical situation. The turning point in the battle came when several Persian ships were disabled or sunk in the center of the straits, creating obstacles that further disrupted Persian formations while providing cover for Greek attacks. As more Persian vessels were damaged or destroyed, the cohesion of the Persian fleet began to break down and individual ships began to flee rather than continue fighting in what was becoming an increasingly hopeless situation. The Greek victory at Salamis was complete and decisive as the Persian fleet was forced to retreat with heavy losses while the surviving Greek ships remained in control of the waters around Attica. The battle demonstrated that Persian naval power was not invincible and that Greek seamanship and tactics could overcome numerical superiority when the conditions were favorable. Xerxes observed the destruction of his fleet from his hilltop position and reportedly realized immediately that the defeat at Salamis had fundamentally altered the strategic situation in Greece. Without naval superiority, the Persian army would have difficulty maintaining its supply lines, while the possibility of Greek naval attacks on Persian communications and bases in Asia Minor created new vulnerabilities that had not existed before the battle. The Persian king made the difficult decision to withdraw the majority of his forces from Greece while leaving a substantial army under the command of Mardonius to continue operations against the remaining Greek resistance. This decision reflected both the practical problems created by the naval defeat and Xerxes' recognition that his personal presence was needed in other parts of the empire where the long absence of the king was beginning to create political difficulties. The retreat of Xerxes and the main Persian army marked the beginning of the end of the Great Invasion, though significant Persian forces remained in Greece and would continue fighting for another year before being finally defeated at the Battle of Plataea. The Persian withdrawal was conducted in good order and without significant harassment from Greek forces who were exhausted by their defensive efforts and not yet strong enough to mount effective pursuit operations. The failure of Xerxes' invasion had profound consequences for both the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states, as it marked the first major defeat of Persian imperial expansion and demonstrated that the empire was not invincible when faced with determined and well-organized resistance. For the Greeks, the successful defense of their independence created new confidence and unity that would influence their subsequent development as a civilization. The invasion also marked a turning point in the relationship between East and West, as the cultural and political differences between Persian and Greek civilizations became more pronounced and antagonistic. The conflicts that began with the Ionian Revolt and reached their climax with Xerxes' invasion would continue to influence relations between Persian and Greek peoples for generations to come. As you listen to these gentle accounts of ancient battles and great invasions, you can feel your breathing becoming even slower and more peaceful, while the steady rhythm of historical narrative helps your mind release the tensions and concerns of the modern world. The fire beside us continues to burn quietly, casting its warm glow as we explore these momentous events that shaped the ancient world and influenced the course of human civilization. The story of Xerxes' invasion reminds us that even the mightiest empires and the most carefully planned military operations can be frustrated by determined resistance and favorable circumstances. The Persian Empire would continue to be a major power for many more centuries, but it would never again attempt such an ambitious expansion into Europe and would gradually turn its attention to other challenges and opportunities. As we continue our peaceful journey through these ancient chronicles, you can feel yourself becoming more and more relaxed, while these quiet tales of long-ago kings and their vast armies help your mind drift gently toward the rest and restoration that sleep provides. The gentle flames beside us flicker softly as we prepare to explore the next chapter in this ancient story of empire and resistance. The gentle flames continue their quiet dance beside us as we turn our peaceful attention to the long twilight years of the Persian Empire, when the great conquests of Cyrus and Darius gave way to a more troubled period marked by internal struggle, succession crises, and the gradual erosion of imperial power. You can feel yourself sinking deeper into relaxation as we explore these quieter chapters of ancient history, where the drama unfolds not in great battles but in the slow processes of political decline and administrative decay that eventually weakened one of history's greatest empires. The failure of Xerxes' massive invasion of Greece marked a turning point in Persian history, not because it immediately threatened the survival of the empire, but because it revealed fundamental limitations in Persian military power and created new vulnerabilities that would be exploited by enemies and rebels in the years to come. The Persian Empire remained vast and wealthy, but it had lost the aura of invincibility that had made resistance seem futile and submission appear to be the wisest policy for potential enemies. Following his return from the Greek expedition, Xerxes found himself facing a series of domestic challenges that required his attention and resources just at the time when the empire's international prestige had been damaged by military defeat. Rebellions broke out in several provinces as local leaders sensed that Persian power was no longer as formidable as it had once appeared, while court politics in the capital became increasingly complex and factional as various nobles competed for influence over the king and control of imperial policy. The Persian court had always been a center of intrigue and political maneuvering, but the aftermath of the Greek defeats created new tensions and uncertainties that made the political environment more volatile and dangerous. Military commanders who had participated in the failed invasion found themselves blamed for the defeats, while court officials who had opposed the expedition claimed vindication for their earlier warnings about the risks involved in such an ambitious undertaking. Xerxes himself appears to have been affected by the failure of his great enterprise and gradually withdrew from active involvement in military affairs, while focusing more attention on building projects and court ceremonies that allowed him to demonstrate his wealth and power in ways that did not risk further military humiliation. The great palace complex at Persepolis was expanded and beautified during this period as the king sought to create monuments to Persian civilization that would endure long after the temporary setbacks in Greece had been forgotten. However, this focus on ceremonial display and architectural grandeur came at a time when the empire needed strong leadership to address the various challenges that were beginning to emerge throughout the Persian territories. The costs of the Greek expedition had been enormous, and the imperial treasury needed time to recover, while various provinces required attention to maintain their loyalty and productivity. The king's withdrawal from active governance created opportunities for ambitious nobles and provincial governors to pursue their own agendas, often at the expense of imperial unity and efficiency. The situation became increasingly unstable during the later years of Xerxes' reign as factional disputes within the court escalated into open conflicts that eventually led to the king's assassination in 465 BCE. The murder of Xerxes was carried out by Artaxerxes, the commander of the royal bodyguard, who had been involved in a complex conspiracy involving various court officials and members of the royal family who believed that a change of leadership was necessary to restore Persian power and prestige. The assassination of Xerxes created a succession crisis that threatened to tear the empire apart as different claimants to the throne sought support from various factions within the Persian nobility and the imperial administration. Artaxerxes initially attempted to place his own candidate on the throne, but was himself killed when Prince Artaxerxes, the son of Xerxes, succeeded in building a coalition of supporters who were strong enough to eliminate the conspirators and establish his authority over the empire. Artaxerxes I, who ruled from 465 to 424 BCE, inherited an empire that was still vast and wealthy but was facing numerous internal and external challenges that required careful management and diplomatic skill to resolve. The new king proved to be a competent administrator who was able to restore stability to the court and rebuild Persian military strength, while also pursuing a more cautious foreign policy that avoided the kind of ambitious expeditions that had led to disaster under his father. One of the most serious challenges facing Artaxerxes was a major rebellion in Egypt led by a native prince named Inaros, who had proclaimed himself pharaoh and was attempting to drive Persian forces out of the Nile Valley with the assistance of Athenian naval support. The Egyptian revolt had begun during the final years of Xerxes' reign but had gained momentum following the king's assassination and the subsequent period of political uncertainty in the Persian capital. The rebellion in Egypt was particularly dangerous because it threatened one of the empire's wealthiest provinces, while also providing an example that might encourage similar uprisings in other regions where local populations resented Persian rule. The involvement of Athens in supporting the Egyptian rebels also represented a continuation of the Greek-Persian conflict that had begun with the Ionian Revolt and reached its climax during Xerxes' invasion of Greece. Artaxerxes devoted considerable resources to suppressing the Egyptian rebellion and eventually succeeded in defeating Inaros and restoring Persian control over the Nile Valley, though the campaign required several years of difficult fighting and significant financial expenditure. The Persian victory in Egypt demonstrated that the empire still possessed the military strength necessary to maintain control over its territories, but the length and cost of the campaign also revealed the challenges involved in governing such a vast and diverse state. The Persian king also had to deal with continuing tensions with the Greek city-states, particularly Athens, which maintained a hostile attitude toward the Persian Empire and continued to interfere in Persian affairs whenever opportunities arose. The conflict between Persia and Athens took many forms, including naval warfare in the eastern Mediterranean, support for rebellions within the Persian Empire, and competition for influence among the various peoples and city-states that bordered Persian territories. However, Artaxerxes proved to be a skillful diplomat who was able to exploit divisions within the Greek world to advance Persian interests without resorting to the kind of massive military campaigns that had proven so costly under his predecessors. The Persian king provided financial support to Sparta and other Greek cities that were rivals of Athens, while also maintaining diplomatic relations with various Greek communities that were willing to accept Persian friendship in exchange for commercial privileges and protection. This more subtle approach to dealing with Greek opposition proved quite effective, as Persian gold helped to finance the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, which lasted for nearly 3 decades and ultimately resulted in the defeat of Athens and the Destruction of Athenian naval power. The Persian Empire benefited enormously from this Greek civil war as it eliminated the most dangerous threat to Persian interests in the eastern Mediterranean while also demonstrating the effectiveness of diplomatic and financial warfare as alternatives to direct military confrontation. The reign of Artaxerxes also saw important developments in Persian internal administration as the king worked to strengthen the imperial bureaucracy and improve the efficiency of provincial governance. The satrapy system that had been established by Darius the Great was refined and expanded while new procedures were introduced for monitoring the performance of provincial governors and ensuring that imperial revenues were collected promptly and accurately. These administrative reforms helped to maintain the stability and prosperity of the Persian Empire during a period when external pressures and internal challenges might otherwise have led to fragmentation and decline. The Persian system of government proved remarkably resilient and adaptable as it was able to accommodate the changing needs of the empire while maintaining the essential features that had made Persian rule effective and generally acceptable to the diverse populations under imperial control. The death of Artaxerxes I in 424 BCE was followed by another succession crisis as several of his sons competed for the throne in a brief but intense civil war that once again threatened imperial unity. The eventual victor was Darius II, who ruled from 423 to 405 BCE and proved to be a capable though not particularly distinguished king who maintained the policies and approaches that his predecessor had established. Darius II faced fewer major crises than his father had dealt with, but he had to contend with the ongoing challenges of governing a vast and complex empire while also managing the continuing rivalry with the Greek city-states and various regional tensions that periodically flared into open conflicts. The king generally succeeded in maintaining imperial stability and prosperity, though his reign was marked by several minor rebellions and diplomatic complications that required careful attention and resources to resolve. One of the most significant developments during the reign of Darius II was the increasing influence of Greek culture and ideas within the Persian Empire as contacts between Persians and Greeks multiplied through trade diplomacy and military service. Many Greeks served as mercenaries in Persian armies, while Persian nobles often employed Greek physicians, teachers, and artists who brought new knowledge and techniques to the imperial court and provinces. This cultural exchange had mixed consequences for the Persian Empire as it contributed to the sophistication and cosmopolitan character of Persian civilization while also potentially undermining traditional Persian values and institutions. Some Persian nobles became deeply influenced by Greek philosophy and political ideas that emphasized individual freedom and democratic governance concepts that were potentially incompatible with the hierarchical and monarchical system that formed the foundation of Persian imperial administration. The reign of Darius II came to an end in 405 BCE when the king died after a relatively long and stable, though not particularly eventful, period of rule. His death precipitated the most serious succession crisis in Persian history, as his two sons Artaxerxes II and Cyrus, the younger, became involved in a civil war that would have far-reaching consequences for the Persian Empire and the broader ancient world. Artaxerxes II initially secured the throne with the support of the imperial administration and the loyalty of most provincial governors, but his younger brother Cyrus refused to accept the succession and began organizing a rebellion that would challenge the unity of the Persian Empire. Cyrus had served as satrap of Lydia and had built up a power base in western Anatolia where he had established close relationships with various Greek cities and had recruited a substantial army that included both Persian troops and Greek mercenaries. The civil war between the two brothers represented more than just a personal conflict over the throne, as it reflected deeper tensions within Persian society between traditionalists who wanted to maintain established established institutions and customs and reformers, who believed that the empire needed to adapt to changing circumstances and adopt new approaches to governance and military organization. Cyrus the Younger had been influenced by his contacts with Greek culture and had apparently developed ideas about military and political reform that differed significantly from traditional Persian practices. His rebellion attracted support from various elements within Persian society who were dissatisfied with the existing system, while also gaining backing from Greek cities that hoped to benefit from a change in Persian leadership. The decisive confrontation between the two brothers took place at the Battle of Cunaxa near Babylon in 401 BCE, where Cyrus led his combined force of Persians and Greeks against the larger army commanded by Artaxerxes II. The battle was initially successful for Cyrus's forces as his Greek mercenaries proved superior to the Persian troops opposing them, but the rebellion collapsed when Cyrus himself was killed during the fighting, leaving his supporters without effective leadership. The death of Cyrus the Younger ended the immediate threat to Artaxerxes, but it also created new problems as the Greek mercenaries who had supported the rebellion found themselves stranded deep in Persian territory without supplies or safe passage home. The famous retreat of these 10,000 Greek soldiers, as described by Xenophon in his Anabasis, became one of the most celebrated military adventures in ancient history and demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of Persian military power. The successful withdrawal of the Greek mercenaries from the heart of the Persian Empire revealed that Persian control over their vast territories was not as complete as it appeared, and that determined enemies could operate within Persian borders for extended periods without being eliminated by imperial forces. This revelation would influence subsequent Greek thinking about the vulnerability of the Persian Empire, and would contribute to the development of plans for more ambitious military operations against Persian territories. Artaxerxes II, who ruled from 404 to 358 BCE, faced the challenge of rebuilding imperial unity and authority following the civil war, while also dealing with various external threats and internal rebellions that had been encouraged by the recent instability. The king proved to be a capable administrator who was generally successful in maintaining the stability of the empire, though his long reign was marked by numerous challenges and crises that required constant attention and resources to resolve. One of the most persistent problems during this period was the recurring rebellion of Egypt, which had taken advantage of the civil war to assert its independence once again under native pharaohs who rejected Persian authority and sought to restore the ancient kingdom's autonomy. The Persian attempts to reconquer Egypt required massive resources and multiple campaigns, but were ultimately unsuccessful as the Egyptians proved able to maintain their independence with occasional support from Greek allies. The failure to reconquer Egypt was a significant blow to Persian prestige and demonstrated that the empire no longer possessed the overwhelming military superiority that had characterized the reigns of Cyrus, Darius, and the early successors. The successful Egyptian resistance also encouraged other provinces to consider rebellion, while providing a model for how determined local populations could successfully challenge Persian authority. Artaxerxes also had to deal with various rebellions and independence movements in other parts of the empire, including Asia Minor, where several satraps attempted to establish autonomous kingdoms while maintaining only nominal allegiance to the Persian crown. These regional challenges reflected the growing difficulty of maintaining effective central control over such vast territories, while also suggesting that the Persian system of provincial administration was beginning to break down under the pressures of external threats and internal divisions. The economic situation of the Persian Empire also became increasingly problematic during this period, as the costs of maintaining the military forces necessary to suppress rebellions and defend the frontiers began to exceed the revenues that could be extracted from the imperial territories. The loss of Egypt eliminated one of the empire's most important sources of wealth, while the various military campaigns required enormous expenditures that strained the imperial treasury and forced the government to impose higher taxes on the remaining provinces. These financial pressures created additional tensions within the empire, as increased taxation generated resentment among provincial populations, while also providing ammunition for rebels and independence movements that could claim to offer relief from Persian fiscal demands. The economic difficulties also made it more difficult for the Persian government to maintain the kind of lavish court ceremonies and building projects that had traditionally been used to demonstrate imperial power and legitimacy. The reign of Artaxerxes II also witnessed significant changes in the international environment as new powers emerged that challenged Persian hegemony in various regions, while traditional enemies like the Greek city-states continued to pose threats to Persian interests. The rise of Macedonia under Philip II created a new center of military power in the Balkans, while various peoples on the northern frontiers of the empire became more aggressive and better organized in their resistance to Persian expansion. These external pressures combined with internal challenges to create a situation where the Persian Empire was increasingly on the defensive and struggling to maintain its existing territories rather than expanding into new regions as it had done during its early centuries. The shift from offensive to defensive strategy reflected the empire's declining relative power, while also suggesting that fundamental changes in military technology and political organization were making the traditional Persian approach to empire building less effective than it had been in the past. The death of Artaxerxes II in 358 BCE marked the end of one of the longest reigns in Persian history and opened another period of succession uncertainty as various claimants competed for the throne. The eventual victor was Artaxerxes III, who proved to be one of the most capable of the later Persian kings, and who succeeded in temporarily reversing some of the empire's decline through energetic military campaigns and administrative reforms. Artaxerxes III, who ruled from 358 to 338 BCE, was a more aggressive and militarily successful ruler than his immediate predecessors, and he managed to reconquer Egypt and suppress various rebellions that had plagued the empire during the previous decades. However, his successes came at enormous cost in terms of both financial resources and human casualties, while also requiring the adoption of increasingly harsh methods of imperial control that alienated many of the empire's subject populations. The reconquest of Egypt by Artaxerxes III demonstrated that the Persian Empire still possessed considerable military strength when properly organized and led, but it also revealed the enormous effort required to maintain control over rebellious provinces and the difficulty of governing such a vast and diverse state through purely military means. The campaign against Egypt required several years of preparation and fighting, while also necessitating the recruitment of large numbers of Greek mercenaries whose loyalty to the Persian crown was always questionable. The increasing reliance on foreign mercenaries reflected the declining quality and reliability of traditional Persian military forces, as well as the empire's growing difficulty in mobilizing sufficient troops from its own population to meet its military needs. The use of Greek soldiers also created potential security risks, as these mercenaries often had divided loyalties and might switch sides if offered better terms by Persian enemies. Despite his military successes, Artaxerxes III was assassinated in 338 BCE by his own court physician, apparently as part of a conspiracy involving various court officials who were dissatisfied with the king's harsh methods and authoritarian approach to governance. The assassination created another succession crisis that further weakened imperial authority and opened new opportunities for ambitious provincial governors and external enemies to challenge Persian power. The brief reign of Artaxerxes IV, who was also murdered after ruling for only 2 years, demonstrated the increasing instability of the Persian political system and the growing influence of court factions that were willing to resort to violence to achieve their political objectives. This period of internal strife and political assassinations created an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that undermined the effectiveness of imperial administration while also encouraging rebellions and independence movements throughout the Persian territories. As you listen to these gentle accounts of ancient political struggles and imperial decline, you can feel your breathing becoming even slower and more peaceful, while the steady rhythm of historical narrative helps your mind release the tensions and concerns of the modern world. The fire beside us continues to burn quietly, casting its warm glow as we explore these quieter but no less significant chapters in the story of one of history's greatest empires. The final years of independent Persian rule were characterized by increasing political instability, military challenges, and economic difficulties that collectively undermined the empire's ability to defend itself against external threats, while also making it difficult to maintain internal unity and order. The succession of weak kings and court conspiracies created an environment where effective governance became nearly impossible, while various provincial governors began to act more like independent rulers than loyal servants of the imperial crown. When Darius III became king in 336 BCE, he inherited an empire that was still nominally vast and wealthy but was facing unprecedented challenges from both internal divisions and external threats. The new king would soon find himself confronted by a young Macedonian conqueror whose ambitions and military innovations would test the Persian Empire's ability to survive in a rapidly changing world. As we continue our peaceful journey through these ancient chronicles, you can feel yourself becoming more and more relaxed, while these quiet tales of political intrigue and imperial twilight help your mind drift gently toward the rest and restoration that sleep provides. The gentle flames continue their quiet dance beside us as we turn our peaceful attention to a new and momentous chapter in the story of the Persian Empire, when a young king from the northern kingdom of Macedonia began to cast his ambitious gaze eastward toward the vast territories that had been ruled by Persian monarchs for more than 2 centuries. You can feel yourself settling even deeper into relaxation as we explore the emergence of Alexander, who would become known to history as Alexander the Great, while the soothing rhythm of these ancient tales helps your mind drift away from all the concerns and tensions of the modern world. The rise of Macedonian power under Philip II had already begun to alter the balance of forces in the eastern Mediterranean during the final decades of independent Persian rule, but it was the accession of Philip's young son Alexander in 336 BCE that would transform what had been a regional challenge into an existential threat to the survival of the Persian Empire itself. Alexander inherited not only his father's throne, but also his ambitious plans for a great expedition against Persia that would unite the Greek world under Macedonian leadership, while also bringing the vast wealth of the Persian Empire under Greek control. Alexander was barely 20 years old when he became king of Macedonia, following his father's assassination at a wedding celebration in the ancient capital of Igi, but despite his youth he had already demonstrated remarkable abilities as both a military commander and a political leader during his service under Philip's guidance. The young prince had received an exceptional education from the philosopher Aristotle, who had taught him not only the practical arts of war and governance, but also the intellectual traditions of Greek culture that would profoundly influence his approach to ruling the diverse populations he would encounter during his eastern campaigns. The new Macedonian king faced immediate challenges to his authority from various Greek city-states that had been forced into alliance with Macedonia under Philip but hoped to regain their independence following the king's death. Alexander's response to these challenges demonstrated both the military skills he had inherited from his father and the personal charisma that would make him one of history's most successful conquerors as he moved swiftly to suppress rebellions in Thrace and Greece, while also preparing for the much larger expedition against Persia that would define his reign. The destruction of Thebes in 335 BCE served as a dramatic demonstration of Alexander's determination to maintain Macedonian control over the Greek world, while also providing a warning to other potential rebels about the consequences of challenging his authority. The young king's decision to spare Athens while utterly destroying Thebes reflected both strategic calculation and an appreciation for Athenian cultural achievements that would characterize his approach to governing the diverse populations he would encounter throughout his career. With Greece secured and his authority firmly established, Alexander turned his attention to the great expedition against Persia that his father had been planning at the time of his assassination. The Macedonian army that crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor in 334 BCE was relatively small by Persian standards, numbering perhaps 35,000 men, but it represented the culmination of decades of military innovation and professional development that had transformed the traditional Greek fighting methods into something far more flexible and effective than anything the ancient world had previously seen. The core of Alexander's army consisted of the Macedonian phalanx armed with the long spears called Cyruses that could keep enemy cavalry and infantry at a distance, while the famous companion cavalry provided the mobile striking force that could exploit weaknesses in enemy formations and pursue retreating foes. These units were supported by various specialist troops including archers, slingers, and siege engineers, as well as contingents from the Greek city-states that provided additional infantry and naval support for the expedition. The Persian Empire that Alexander invaded was still nominally vast and wealthy, but it was weakened by the internal divisions and succession crises that had characterized the final decades of Achaemenid rule. Darius III, who had become the last Persian king in 336 BCE, was an able administrator, but he lacked the military experience and charismatic leadership that would be necessary to coordinate effective resistance against the highly motivated and superbly organized Macedonian invasion force. The Persian response to Alexander's landing in Asia Minor was initially hampered by the same problems that had plagued the empire during its recent internal conflicts, as various satraps and military commanders pursued their own strategies without effective coordination from the central government. The Persian forces in western Anatolia were substantial, but they were scattered among different commanders who had conflicting views about how best to respond to the Macedonian threat. Alexander's first major victory came at the river Granicus, where he encountered a Persian army commanded by the local satraps who had decided to make an immediate stand against the invaders rather than withdrawing to more defensible positions further inland. The Battle of the Granicus demonstrated both the tactical superiority of the Macedonian army and Alexander's personal courage, as he led the crucial cavalry charge that broke the Persian resistance and opened the way for his advance into the heart of Anatolia. The victory at Granicus had important political as well as military consequences, as it established Alexander's reputation as an invincible general while also demonstrating to the populations of Asia Minor that Persian power was no longer sufficient to protect them from foreign invasion. Many of the Greek cities along the coast welcomed Alexander as a liberator who would restore their freedom from Persian rule, while other communities calculated that submission to the Macedonians offered better prospects than continued loyalty to a declining Persian Empire. Alexander's treatment of the conquered territories in western Anatolia reflected both practical political considerations and the influence of Greek political ideals that emphasized the importance of freedom and self-governance for Greek communities. The Macedonian king generally restored democratic institutions in the Greek cities while abolishing the tribute payments that had been required under Persian rule. However, he also made it clear that these privileges depended on continued loyalty to his cause, and that rebellion would be met with swift and severe punishment. He advanced through western Anatolia, also demonstrated Alexander's remarkable ability to adapt his military and political strategies to local conditions while maintaining the cohesion and morale of his army during a campaign that would eventually last for more than a decade. The Macedonian king understood that success in conquering the Persian Empire would require not only military victories, but also effective governance of the diverse populations he encountered and the integration of local resources and personnel into his expanding administration. One of the most famous episodes from this early phase of the campaign was Alexander's encounter with the Gordian knot at the ancient city of Gordium, where according to legend whoever could untie an impossibly complex knot would become ruler of Asia. When Alexander was unable to solve the puzzle through conventional means, he reportedly drew his sword and cut through the knot, declaring that it mattered not how the prophecy was fulfilled, but only that it was fulfilled. This story, whether historically accurate or not, became symbolic of Alexander's direct and decisive approach to the challenges he faced during his eastern campaigns. The Persian response to Alexander's early successes was initially confused and ineffective, as Darius III struggled to coordinate resistance from his distant capital, while also dealing with various internal challenges that continued to plague the empire. The Persian king eventually recognized that he would need to take personal command of the imperial forces if he hoped to stop the Macedonian advance, but the process of mobilizing and organizing a sufficiently large army required time that Alexander used to consolidate his control over western Anatolia and to prepare for the larger confrontations that lay ahead. Meanwhile, Alexander continued his advance along the Mediterranean coast, where he encountered the powerful trading city of Halicarnassus, which was defended by Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek mercenary commander who had entered Persian service and proved to be one of the most capable military opponents that Alexander would face during his early campaigns. The Siege of Halicarnassus demonstrated the effectiveness of Macedonian siege techniques, while also revealing some of the challenges that Alexander would face in conquering the strongly fortified cities that controlled key strategic positions throughout the Persian Empire. The successful capture of Halicarnassus eliminated the last major Persian stronghold in western Anatolia and allowed Alexander to continue his advance toward the more heavily populated and wealthy regions of Central and Eastern Asia Minor. However, the campaign also demonstrated that conquest of the Persian Empire would be a far more complex and time-consuming enterprise than the rapid victories in Greece and western Anatolia might have suggested. As Alexander moved inland from the coast, he encountered different types of terrain and populations that required adjustments in both his military tactics and his administrative policies. The mountainous regions of central Anatolia were inhabited by various tribal peoples who had maintained their independence from Persian rule through guerrilla warfare and defensive strategies that took advantage of the difficult terrain to neutralize the advantages of regular armies. The Macedonian army's adaptation to these challenging conditions demonstrated both its professional flexibility and Alexander's growing understanding of the diverse military and political challenges involved in conquering and governing such a vast and varied empire. The young king proved remarkably adept at learning from his experiences and incorporating new techniques and strategies into his approach as the campaign progressed. The winter of 334 to 333 BCE was spent in careful preparation for the next phase of the campaign, as Alexander recognized that he would soon face much larger Persian armies commanded by Darius himself and that the outcome of these confrontations would largely determine whether his expedition would succeed in conquering the Persian Empire or would become another failed attempt to challenge Persian power in Asia. During this period of preparation, Alexander also devoted considerable attention to the complex diplomatic and administrative challenges involved in governing the territories he had already conquered while maintaining the loyalty and effectiveness of his army as it moved further from its home base in Macedonia. The king's ability to balance these competing demands while also planning for future military operations demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of imperial administration that would be crucial to his ultimate success. The arrival of spring 333 BCE brought news that Darius III was personally leading a massive Persian army westward from Babylon with the intention of confronting Alexander and driving the Macedonian invaders out of Asia. The Persian king had spent months assembling forces from throughout his empire, and the army he commanded was reported to be the largest that Persia had fielded since the great invasion of Greece under Xerxes more than a century earlier. This development marked a crucial turning point in the campaign, as it meant that Alexander would no longer be facing isolated provincial forces but would instead have to contend with the full military power of the Persian Empire concentrated under the personal command of the great king himself. The prospect of such a confrontation was both an opportunity and a threat for Alexander, as victory would establish his reputation as a conqueror of the first rank, while defeat would likely mean the destruction of his army and the end of his dreams of Eastern conquest. Alexander's response to the news of Darius's advance demonstrated both his strategic acumen and his understanding of the psychological factors that would influence the outcome of the coming battle. Rather than retreating to more defensible positions or attempting to avoid a direct confrontation, the Macedonian king chose to advance boldly toward the Persian army while also taking steps to ensure that his soldiers understood the stakes involved and were properly motivated for what would be the most important battle of the campaign thus far. The armies of Alexander and Darius met in the coastal plain near the city of Issus, where the confined terrain would limit the Persian ability to deploy their superior numbers effectively, while allowing the more professional and better trained Macedonian forces to maximize their tactical advantages. The choice of battlefield reflected Alexander's growing confidence in his army's capabilities, as well as his understanding of how terrain could be used to offset numerical disadvantages. As the two armies prepared for battle, both kings understood that the outcome would have consequences far beyond the immediate military situation, as a Persian victory would likely encourage rebellions throughout Alexander's newly conquered territories, while a Macedonian success would demonstrate that even the personal intervention of the great king was insufficient to stop Alexander's advance into the heart of the Persian Empire. The night before the battle, both Alexander and Darius reportedly spent considerable time consulting with their advisors and making final preparations for what both recognized would be one of the most important military confrontations in ancient history. The Persian king commanded forces that included not only traditional Persian troops but also contingents from throughout his empire, as well as substantial numbers of Greek mercenaries whose loyalty had been secured through generous financial incentives. Alexander's army, while smaller, was composed primarily of Macedonian and Greek troops who had been fighting together for several years and had developed the kind of unit cohesion and mutual confidence that could be crucial in determining the outcome of closely contested battles. The Macedonian king also had the advantage of detailed intelligence about Persian military capabilities and tactics gathered during his earlier victories, while Darius was still learning about the strengths and weaknesses of his new enemy. The personal stakes involved in the coming confrontation were enormous for both leaders, as Alexander's entire enterprise depended on continued military success, while Darius faced the prospect of losing not only a battle but potentially his entire empire if he could not stop the Macedonian advance. The psychological pressure on both commanders was intense as they prepared to lead their armies into a battle that would determine the fate of one of history's greatest empires. As you listen to these gentle accounts of ancient military preparations and imperial confrontations, you can feel your breathing becoming even slower and more peaceful, while the steady rhythm of historical narrative helps your mind release the tensions and concerns of the modern world. The fire beside us continues to burn quietly, casting its warm glow as we explore these momentous events that would reshape the ancient world and influence the course of human civilization. The stage was now set for the great confrontation between East and West, between the young Macedonian conqueror and the ancient Persian Empire that had dominated the Eastern world for more than 2 centuries. The outcome of the coming battles would determine not only the fate of Darius and Alexander, but also the future political and cultural development of the vast territories that stretched from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. As we continue our peaceful journey through these ancient chronicles, you can feel yourself becoming more and more relaxed, while these quiet tales of ambition and empire help your mind drift gently toward the rest and restoration that sleep provides. The gentle flames beside us flicker softly as we prepare to explore the next chapter in this ancient story of conquest and the clash between 2 very different approaches to governing the diverse peoples of the ancient world. The gentle flames continue their quiet dance beside us as we move deeper into our peaceful exploration of the final great confrontations between Alexander of Macedonia and the ancient Persian Empire, when 2 very different worlds would meet in battles that would determine the fate of civilizations and reshape the political landscape of the ancient world forever. You can feel yourself sinking into an even deeper state of relaxation as we follow these momentous events, while the soothing rhythm of these ancient tales helps your mind drift away from all the concerns and tensions of the modern world. The great battle that had been building since Alexander's landing in Asia Minor finally took place on the coastal plain near Issus in November 333 BCE, where the narrow terrain between the mountains and the sea would force both armies to fight in confined space that favored tactical skill over numerical superiority. The Persian army, commanded by Darius III, was enormous even by the standards of previous Persian expeditions, and included contingents from throughout the empire, as well as substantial numbers of Greek mercenaries whose professional skills were intended to match the military advantages that Alexander had enjoyed in his previous victories. However, the confined battlefield at Issus prevented Darius from deploying his vast forces effectively, while allowing Alexander to concentrate his best troops against the crucial points in the Persian formation where decisive results could be achieved. The Macedonian phalanx advanced steadily against the Persian center, while Alexander himself led the companion cavalry in a devastating charge against the Persian left wing that shattered the enemy resistance and opened the way for a complete victory. The Battle of Issus was notable not only for its military outcome, but also for the personal drama that unfolded when Alexander captured the family of Darius, including the Persian queen mother and the king's wife and daughters, who had been traveling with the royal army according to Persian custom. The treatment of these royal captives would demonstrate Alexander's growing understanding of Persian culture and his desire to present himself as a legitimate successor to the Persian throne rather than merely a foreign conqueror. Alexander's decision to treat the Persian royal family with honor and respect reflected both his natural generosity and his sophisticated grasp of the political symbolism involved in his conquest of the Persian Empire. By showing consideration for Persian customs and treating the defeated king's family according to their royal dignity, Alexander sent a powerful message to Persian nobles and administrators that submission to his rule would not necessarily involve humiliation or the destruction of traditional Persian institutions. The defeat at Issus forced Darius to flee eastward, abandoning not only his family but also the vast treasures that had accompanied the royal army, and that now fell into Alexander's hands as spoils of victory. The wealth captured at Issus provided Alexander with the financial resources necessary to continue his campaign, while also demonstrating to his soldiers that service in the eastern expedition would bring material rewards as well as military glory. The psychological impact of the victory at Issus was perhaps even more important than the immediate military and financial gains, as it established Alexander's reputation as an invincible general, while also proving that even the personal intervention of the Persian great king was insufficient to stop the Macedonian advance. The news of Darius's defeat spread rapidly throughout the Persian Empire, where it encouraged defections and rebellions while undermining the morale and loyalty of Persian forces that had not yet encountered Alexander's army. Following his victory at Issus, Alexander made the strategic decision to secure the eastern Mediterranean coast before pursuing Darius into the interior of the Persian Empire. This choice reflected the young king's understanding that control of the sea would be crucial for maintaining communication with Macedonia and for preventing Persian naval forces from threatening his supply lines or stirring up rebellions in the territories he had already conquered. The campaign along the Levantine coast brought Alexander into contact with some of the most ancient and sophisticated cities in the world, including the great trading centers of Sidon and Tyre that had maintained their prosperity and independence through centuries of changing political control. The response of these cities to Alexander's approach varied considerably, as some welcomed him as a liberator while others prepared to resist what they viewed as yet another attempt at foreign conquest. The city of Sidon submitted voluntarily to Alexander and was rewarded with favorable treatment that demonstrated the benefits of peaceful cooperation with the Macedonian conquest. However, the island city of Tyre chose to resist Alexander's demands for submission and prepared for a siege that would become one of the most famous military operations in ancient history and would test both Alexander's determination and the engineering capabilities of his army. The Siege of Tyre lasted for 7 months and required Alexander to overcome seemingly impossible geographical obstacles, as the city was located on an island connected to the mainland only by a narrow causeway that could be easily defended by the Tyrian navy. The Macedonian solution to this challenge involved the construction of a massive artificial mole that would extend the existing causeway and allow siege engines to be brought within range of the city walls. The construction of the mole required enormous quantities of stone and timber, as well as the labor of thousands of workers who had to continue their dangerous task despite constant attacks from Tyrian ships and the technical difficulties involved in building in deep water under combat conditions. The project demonstrated both the determination of Alexander and his army and the remarkable engineering skills that had been developed by Macedonian military technicians. The eventual fall of Tyre after such prolonged resistance resulted in harsh treatment for the city's population, as Alexander ordered the execution of the city's defenders and the enslavement of the surviving inhabitants. This severe punishment was intended to serve as an example to other cities that might consider resisting Macedonian demands, and demonstrated that Alexander could be as ruthless as he was generous depending on the circumstances and the choices made by his enemies. The capture of Tyre eliminated the last major obstacle to Alexander's control of the eastern Mediterranean coast and opened the way for his advance into Egypt, where the Persian garrison was too weak to offer effective resistance, and where the native population had long resented Persian rule and was ready to welcome any conqueror who promised to restore Egyptian independence and respect for traditional Egyptian customs and religion. Alexander's entry into Egypt in late 332 BCE was a triumph that established his reputation as a liberator rather than a conqueror, and demonstrated his growing skill at adapting his approach to the specific conditions and expectations of different populations within the Persian Empire. The young king was crowned as pharaoh according to ancient Egyptian customs and participated in traditional religious ceremonies that legitimized his rule in the eyes of the Egyptian people, while also providing him with access to the enormous wealth of the Nile Valley. During his stay in Egypt, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria, which would become one of the greatest centers of learning and commerce in the ancient world and would serve as a lasting monument to his vision of a cosmopolitan civilization that could unite the best elements of Greek and Eastern cultures. The location of Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile was chosen to facilitate trade between the Mediterranean world and the rich agricultural regions of Upper Egypt, while also providing a secure base for future operations in the Eastern Mediterranean. The young king also made a famous journey to the Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa Oasis, where according to ancient accounts he was recognized as the son of the god and received prophecies about his future conquests and his destiny as a world ruler. Whether or not Alexander actually believed these divine claims, the recognition by one of the most ancient and respected oracles in the world provided valuable religious legitimacy for his rule over the diverse populations of his growing empire. The winter spent in Egypt allowed Alexander to rest and reorganize his army while also planning the next phase of his campaign against the Persian Empire. The king understood that Darius would use the time to assemble another massive army and that the coming confrontation would likely be even larger and more decisive than the battle at Issus. The strategic situation favored Alexander, as his control of the Mediterranean coast had eliminated the possibility of Persian naval interference, while his growing reputation was encouraging defections and rebellions throughout the Persian territories. In the spring of 331 BC, Alexander led his army out of Egypt and began the long march toward Mesopotamia, where Darius was reportedly assembling the largest army in Persian history, with contingents drawn from every corner of the empire, including elephants from India, cavalry from Central Asia, and infantry from dozens of different regions, each contributing their distinctive military traditions and fighting techniques to the massive Persian host. The Persian preparations for this final confrontation involved not only the mobilization of enormous military forces, but also careful attention to choosing a battlefield that would allow Darius to deploy his superior numbers most effectively. The Persian king selected the plain near Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia, where the flat terrain would allow his cavalry and chariots to operate freely, while also providing space for the complex maneuvers required to coordinate such a diverse and enormous army. Darius also attempted to gain tactical advantages through battlefield preparation, including the construction of obstacles designed to disrupt Alexander's anticipated cavalry charges and the clearing of areas where Persian chariots could operate most effectively. These preparations demonstrated both the Persian king's determination to achieve victory and his understanding of the tactical innovations that had made Alexander's army so successful in previous battles. When Alexander learned of Darius's preparations, he recognized that the coming battle would likely determine the fate of the entire Persian Empire, and spent considerable time preparing his own forces for what would be the greatest military challenge of his career. The Macedonian army had grown somewhat since the beginning of the campaign through the incorporation of allied troops and the recruitment of local forces, but it remained vastly outnumbered by the Persian host that awaited it at Gaugamela. The approach to the battlefield took several weeks as Alexander moved his army across the difficult terrain of northern Syria and Mesopotamia while maintaining careful watch for Persian attempts to interfere with his advance or to launch surprise attacks against his forces. The Macedonian king used this time to gather intelligence about Persian dispositions and to plan the tactical innovations that would be necessary to overcome such overwhelming numerical disadvantage. The two armies finally came within sight of each other on the plain of Gaugamela in early October 331 BCE, where both kings spent several days in final preparations and last-minute attempts to gain psychological or tactical advantages before committing to what both recognized would be one of the most important battles in ancient history. The stakes could hardly have been higher, as victory for Darius would likely mean the preservation of the Persian Empire, while success for Alexander would open the way to conquest of the richest and most ancient territories in the known world. The Battle of Gaugamela began at dawn when Alexander launched a complex attack that combined direct assault with sophisticated tactical maneuvers designed to disrupt the Persian formation and create opportunities for decisive cavalry charges against vulnerable points in the enemy line. The Persian army initially resisted effectively, and the outcome remained uncertain for several hours as both sides committed their reserves and struggled for advantage in what became the largest battle fought in the ancient world up to that time. The turning point came when Alexander personally led a cavalry charge that broke through the Persian center and threatened Darius's position, forcing the Persian king to flee from the battlefield and leaving his army without effective leadership. The collapse of central command led to the disintegration of Persian resistance as various contingents began to retreat independently while others surrendered or simply melted away into the surrounding countryside. The victory at Gaugamela was complete and decisive, as it eliminated the last major Persian army and opened the way for Alexander to advance into the heartland of the Persian Empire without significant military opposition. The psychological impact of Darius's second flight from battle was enormous, as it convinced many Persian nobles and administrators that resistance was futile, and that their best hope for preserving their positions and protecting their territories lay in submitting to Alexander and seeking accommodation with the new order he was creating. The immediate aftermath of Gaugamela saw Alexander advancing rapidly toward Babylon, where the Persian satraps surrendered the city without resistance and welcomed the Macedonian king as the new ruler of Mesopotamia. The peaceful submission of Babylon demonstrated the effectiveness of Alexander's policy of treating cooperative subjects with generosity while also providing him with access to one of the greatest treasure repositories in the ancient world. The wealth captured at Babylon was staggering even by the standards of Alexander's previous conquests, and included not only vast quantities of gold and silver, but also precious stones, artwork, and luxury goods that had been accumulated over centuries of Persian rule. This treasure provided Alexander with the financial resources necessary to reward his soldiers, maintain his growing administration, and finance the continuing campaign, while also demonstrating the material benefits that came with service in his army. From Babylon, Alexander continued his advance toward the ancient ceremonial capital of Persepolis, where the Persian kings had built their most magnificent palaces, and where the royal treasury contained the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of imperial conquest. The approach to Persepolis took several months, as Alexander had to secure his control over the intervening territories while also dealing with various administrative and diplomatic challenges involved in governing his rapidly expanding empire. The capture of Persepolis in early 330 BCE marked the symbolic end of Persian imperial power, as Alexander seized control of the most sacred site of Persian monarchy and gained possession of treasures that reportedly required thousands of pack animals to transport. The wealth found at Persepolis exceeded even the enormous riches captured at Babylon and demonstrated the incredible prosperity that the Persian Empire had generated through 2 centuries of successful imperial administration. However, the occupation of Persepolis also presented Alexander with complex decisions about how to treat the symbols and institutions of Persian royal power. The young king initially appeared to respect the sanctity of the site and maintained the palace complex as a functioning administrative center where he could receive the submission of Persian nobles and conduct the ceremonies appropriate to his new status as successor to the Achaemenid throne. The situation changed dramatically during a banquet held in the palace when, according to ancient accounts, Alexander was persuaded by his companions to burn the magnificent buildings as revenge for the Persian destruction of Athens during Xerxes' invasion of Greece more than a century earlier. The burning of Persepolis was reportedly carried out in a spirit of celebration and revenge, but the destruction of such magnificent architecture was later regretted by Alexander, who recognized that he had eliminated irreplaceable monuments to Persian civilization. The burning of Persepolis had enormous symbolic significance throughout the ancient world, as it demonstrated that the Persian Empire had truly come to an end and that a new era was beginning under Macedonian leadership. However, the destruction also alienated many Persians who had been willing to accept Alexander's rule but found it difficult to forgive the desecration of their most sacred royal site. The fall of Persepolis effectively ended organized Persian resistance to Alexander's conquest, though Darius III remained at large and continued to claim royal authority while attempting to rally support for continued resistance in the eastern provinces of the empire. The last Persian king had retreated to the region of Media, where he hoped to find enough loyal supporters to organize another army that might be able to challenge Alexander's control over the Persian territories. However, Darius's position had been fatally weakened by his repeated defeats, and his flight from two major battles had destroyed his credibility as a military leader, while also encouraging defections among the Persian nobility, who increasingly viewed submission to Alexander as preferable to continued loyalty to a king who seemed incapable of defending their interests. The Persian royal family that had been captured at Issus remained in Alexander's custody, and their treatment had demonstrated that the Macedonian king could be a generous and respectful ruler for those who accepted his authority. The pursuit of Darius took Alexander deeper into the eastern regions of the former Persian Empire, where he encountered different cultures and civilizations that had been incorporated into the Persian system but had maintained their distinctive characteristics and traditions. These encounters broadened Alexander's understanding of the diversity of the empire he was conquering and influenced his evolving ideas about how such a vast and varied domain could be effectively governed. The administrative challenges facing Alexander were enormous, as he had to maintain control over territories that stretched from Egypt to Central Asia, while also integrating former Persian officials and institutions into a new governmental system that could function under Macedonian leadership. The young king's solution involved a complex mixture of Macedonian military control and Persian administrative continuity that allowed him to utilize existing expertise while ensuring that ultimate authority remained in his hands. The cultural implications of Alexander's conquest were equally profound, as the meeting between Greek and Persian civilizations created opportunities for intellectual and artistic exchange that would influence the development of both cultures for centuries to come. The cosmopolitan court that Alexander was creating brought together scholars, artists, and administrators from many different traditions and encouraged the kind of cultural synthesis that would become one of the most important legacies of his conquests. As you listen to these gentle accounts of ancient battles and imperial transitions, you can feel your breathing becoming even slower and more peaceful, while the steady rhythm of historical narrative helps your mind release the tensions and concerns of the modern world. The fire beside us continues to burn quietly, casting its warm glow as we explore these momentous events that brought an end to one of history's greatest empires while also creating the foundation for new forms of political and cultural organization. The fall of the Persian Empire marked not only the end of Achaemenid rule but also the beginning of a new chapter in ancient history when Greek and Eastern civilizations would be brought together under unified political authority for the first time. The synthesis of cultures that resulted from Alexander's conquests would have lasting influence on art, literature, philosophy, and religion throughout the ancient world, while also creating new models of imperial administration that would be studied and emulated by later rulers. The story of these final battles reminds us that even the mightiest empires and the most established political systems can be transformed by determined leadership and military innovation combined with the ability to adapt to changing circumstances and to learn from different cultural traditions. As we continue our peaceful journey through these ancient chronicles, you can feel yourself becoming more and more relaxed while these quiet tales of conquest and cultural transformation help your mind drift gently toward the rest and restoration that sleep provides. The gentle flames beside us flicker softly as we prepare to explore the final chapters in this ancient story of empire and the personal fate of the last Persian king, who would soon meet his end in the remote regions of his former domain, while Alexander continued his relentless advance toward the farthest corners of the known world. The gentle flames continue their quiet dance beside us as we approach the final chapters of our peaceful journey through the ancient Persian Empire when the last remnants of Achaemenid power would fade away in the remote eastern provinces while Alexander continued his relentless pursuit of the fleeing Persian king who had become a shadow of his former imperial majesty. You can feel yourself settling into the deepest state of relaxation as we follow these concluding events, while the soothing rhythm of these ancient tales helps your mind drift toward complete peace and tranquility. The pursuit of Darius III through the eastern regions of his former empire had become less a military campaign than a manhunt as the last Persian king found himself increasingly isolated from his former subjects who were either submitting to Alexander or simply choosing to remain neutral rather than risk their lives for a ruler who had proven incapable of defending his realm. The great cities of the east opened their gates to the advancing Macedonian army, while Persian nobles began to calculate whether their futures lay with the discredited Darius or with the victorious Alexander, who had demonstrated both military prowess and political wisdom in his treatment of conquered territories. Darius had retreated first to Ecbatana, the ancient Median capital, where he hoped to find support among the traditional Persian heartland populations, but even there his reception was lukewarm as local leaders recognized that resistance to Alexander would likely bring destruction while submission might preserve their positions and protect their communities. The Persian king's attempts to rally support for continued resistance were hampered by his reputation for fleeing from battle and by the obvious superiority of Alexander's military forces, which had proven capable of defeating any Persian army, regardless of its size or composition. As Alexander approached Ecbatana, Darius was forced to flee once again, this time toward the Caspian Gates, where he hoped to find refuge among the Parthian and Bactrian satraps who controlled the eastern frontiers of the empire and who might be more willing to continue fighting than the war-weary populations of the western provinces. However, this retreat into increasingly remote and difficult terrain only served to emphasize the desperate nature of Darius's situation and to encourage further defections among his remaining supporters who could see no realistic prospect of reversing the tide of conquest. The small force that accompanied Darius in his flight eastward included some loyal Persian nobles and a few thousand soldiers who remained committed to their king despite the hopelessness of their situation. Among these followers was Bessus the satrap of Bactria, who commanded respect as a military leader and who controlled important territories in the far northeast of the empire where resistance might be sustained even after the heartland provinces had fallen to Alexander. However, as the retreat continued and it became increasingly clear that Darius would not be able to mount effective resistance against Alexander's advance, Bessus and other remaining supporters began to consider whether their loyalty to the defeated king was worth the inevitable destruction that would result from continued opposition to the Macedonian conqueror. The harsh realities of their military situation forced these Persian leaders to contemplate the previously unthinkable possibility of abandoning their king in order to save themselves and their followers. The crisis came to a head when Darius's small army reached the region near modern Afghanistan, where the physical hardships of the retreat and the psychological pressure of constant pursuit had begun to break down military discipline and political loyalty among the remaining Persian forces. Bessus and several other commanders began to argue that their only hope of survival lay in making peace with Alexander, and that Darius's continued claims to royal authority were an obstacle to such negotiations. The conspiracy against Darius developed quickly as the Persian commanders recognized that Alexander's rapid advance would soon overtake their retreating force and that they had little time to arrange the kind of dramatic gesture that might demonstrate their willingness to abandon their former allegiance and seek accommodation with the new order. The decision to murder their king was not taken lightly, as it violated the most fundamental principles of Persian loyalty and honor, but the conspirators convinced themselves that desperate circumstances required desperate measures. The assassination of Darius III took place in July 330 BCE, when the last Persian king was stabbed by his own followers as they prepared to abandon their baggage and flee on horseback in a final attempt to escape Alexander's pursuing forces. The murder was carried out hastily and brutally, as the conspirators feared that delay would eliminate their opportunity to demonstrate their break with the old regime, while also ensuring that Darius could never again rally Persian resistance against Macedonian rule. When Alexander's advance guard discovered the body of Darius, they found the last Persian king dying beside the road where he had been left by his assassins, who had fled eastward hoping that their dramatic betrayal would earn them favorable treatment from the Macedonian conqueror. According to ancient accounts, Alexander was genuinely moved by the sight of his fallen enemy and ordered that Darius be given a royal funeral appropriate to his status as a former great king despite the circumstances of his death. The funeral of Darius III marked the symbolic end of the Persian Empire, as Alexander arranged for the last Achaemenid king to be buried at Persepolis alongside his royal ancestors, with ceremonies that honored Persian traditions, while also demonstrating the respect that the Macedonian conqueror felt for the civilization he had conquered. This gesture of magnanimity toward his defeated enemy reflected Alexander's understanding that successful imperial rule required the acceptance and cooperation of Persian elites, who needed to believe that their cultural traditions would be respected under the new dispensation. However, the death of Darius also created new challenges for Alexander, as the removal of the legitimate Persian king opened questions about the nature and legitimacy of Macedonian rule over the former Persian territories. The young conqueror had initially been able to present himself as the enemy of Darius rather than of Persia itself, but with the Persian king dead, Alexander had to decide whether he would rule as a foreign occupier or attempt to present himself as the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid throne. Alexander's solution to this dilemma involved a complex synthesis of Macedonian and Persian governmental traditions that allowed him to maintain the loyalty of his Macedonian followers while also winning acceptance from Persian administrators and Nobles who possessed the expertise necessary to govern the vast eastern territories effectively. The king began to adopt certain Persian royal customs and ceremonial practices while also requiring his courtiers to show him the kind of reverence that had traditionally been reserved for Persian monarchs. These changes in court protocol and royal behavior created tensions with some of Alexander's Macedonian companions who felt that their king was becoming too influenced by foreign customs and was abandoning the Greek values that had supposedly motivated his expedition against Persia. The cultural conflicts that emerged within Alexander's court reflected the broader challenges involved in creating a unified governmental system that could accommodate both Macedonian military traditions and Persian administrative sophistication. The pursuit and punishment of Darius's assassins provided Alexander with an opportunity to demonstrate his commitment to justice while also showing his respect for the principle of royal legitimacy that was central to Persian political culture. Bessus, who had claimed the title of Great King after murdering Darius, was hunted down and executed in a manner that emphasized the gravity of his crime against royal authority, while also serving as a warning to other potential rebels about the consequences of challenging Alexander's rule. The execution of Bessus effectively eliminated the last organized resistance to Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire, though scattered rebellions and tribal uprisings would continue to plague the eastern provinces for several more years. The death of the self-proclaimed successor to Darius removed any alternative focus for Persian loyalty while also demonstrating that Alexander possessed both the determination and the resources necessary to pursue his enemies to the remotest corners of the ancient world. With the Persian Empire finally under his complete control, Alexander turned his attention to the even more ambitious project of extending his conquests beyond the traditional boundaries of Persian rule into the mysterious lands of India, where he hoped to reach the Eastern Ocean that ancient geographers believed marked the edge of the inhabited world. These further campaigns would test the limits of Macedonian military capabilities while also exploring territories that had been largely unknown to the Mediterranean civilizations. However, the conquest of India proved to be far more difficult than Alexander had anticipated, as he encountered new forms of military technology, including war elephants and different tactical challenges posed by the monsoon climate and the complex political divisions that characterized the Indian subcontinent. The Indian campaigns also revealed the growing war weariness of Alexander's soldiers, who had been fighting continuously for nearly a decade and were increasingly reluctant to continue their advance into unknown territories so far from their Macedonian homeland. The eventual decision to halt the eastward advance and begin the return journey to Babylon marked the effective end of Alexander's career as a conqueror, though he would continue to plan new expeditions and administrative reforms until his death in 323 BC. The return from India allowed Alexander to consolidate his control over his vast empire while also beginning the complex process of creating governmental institutions that could survive his death and provide continuity for the diverse populations under his rule. The administrative system that Alexander developed for governing his empire combined elements from Macedonian, Greek, and Persian traditions, while also incorporating innovations designed to address the unique challenges posed by ruling such a vast and culturally diverse domain. The king appointed both Macedonian and Persian officials to important positions while encouraging intermarriage between the different ethnic groups as a means of creating bonds of loyalty that transcended traditional cultural boundaries. These policies of cultural integration and administrative cooperation represented a significant departure from the typical ancient approach to imperial governance, which usually involved the imposition of the conqueror's culture and institutions on subject populations. Alexander's more inclusive approach reflected both his personal admiration for Persian civilization and his practical understanding that effective rule over such diverse territories required the willing cooperation of local elites and administrators. The death of Alexander in Babylon in June 323 BCE created an immediate succession crisis, as he had failed to designate a clear heir or to establish institutional mechanisms that could ensure the peaceful transition of power after his death. The empire that Alexander had built through conquest and personal charisma proved unable to survive the loss of its founder and quickly fragmented into several competing kingdoms ruled by his former generals, who became known to history as the successors. The breakup of Alexander's empire marked the beginning of the Hellenistic period in ancient history, when Greek culture and political institutions would be spread throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia, while also being transformed through contact with the diverse civilizations that had been brought together under Macedonian rule. The Persian territories were eventually divided among several Hellenistic kingdoms, with the Seleucid Empire controlling most of the former Persian heartland, while other regions fell under the control of different successor states. However, the Persian cultural and administrative traditions that had been preserved and adapted under Alexander's rule continued to influence governmental practices throughout the Hellenistic world, while also providing the foundation for the later revival of Persian political power under the Parthian and Sassanid dynasties. The synthesis of Greek and Persian civilizations that had begun during Alexander's conquests would continue to shape the development of both cultures for centuries to come, while also contributing to the broader process of cultural exchange that characterized the ancient world. The story of the Persian Empire, from its foundation under Cyrus the Great to its conquest by Alexander, represents one of the most remarkable chapters in ancient history, as it demonstrates both the possibilities and the limitations of imperial rule in the pre-modern world. The Persian achievement in creating and maintaining a unified governmental system that could accommodate dozens of different peoples and cultures, while also promoting trade prosperity and relative peace throughout such vast territories, remains an impressive example of successful multicultural administration. The tolerance and administrative sophistication that characterized Persian rule at its best provided a model for later imperial systems, while also demonstrating that effective governance of diverse populations requires respect for local traditions and customs, rather than the imposition of uniform cultural standards. The Persian emphasis on justice, truth, and respect for local autonomy created a form of imperial rule that was generally preferable to the alternatives available in the ancient world, and that earned the loyalty of most subject populations for more than 2 centuries. The ultimate failure of the Persian Empire to resist Alexander's conquest reflected not fundamental weaknesses in Persian civilization, but rather the exceptional military innovations and personal leadership that the Macedonian conqueror brought to his campaigns. The Persian army and administrative system that had proven effective against all previous challenges were simply unable to adapt quickly enough to the new tactical and strategic approaches that Alexander employed, while also lacking the kind of unified command structure that might have coordinated more effective resistance. The legacy of the Persian Empire extended far beyond its political boundaries and historical chronology, as Persian cultural achievements in art, architecture, literature, and religion continued to influence later civilizations long after the fall of the Achaemenid dynasty. The Persian contribution to the development of administrative techniques, legal systems, and diplomatic practices provided foundations that would be built upon by subsequent empires, while Persian artistic and architectural styles continued to inspire creators throughout the ancient and medieval worlds. The encounter between Persian and Greek civilizations that reached its climax during Alexander's conquests also created new forms of cultural synthesis that enriched both traditions while contributing to the cosmopolitan character that would define them. Hellenistic period. The mutual influence between East and West that began during the Persian Wars and reached its culmination under Alexander established patterns of cultural exchange that would continue to shape human civilization for centuries to come. As our gentle journey through the chronicles of the ancient Persian Empire draws toward its peaceful conclusion, you can feel yourself becoming completely relaxed while these quiet tales of long-ago kings and their vast dominions help your mind release all remaining tensions and concerns. The fire beside us burns steadily, casting its warm glow as we reflect on the remarkable achievements and eventual transformation of one of history's greatest empires while preparing to drift into the restorative peace that comes with sleep. The story we have explored together reminds us that all human institutions and achievements are temporary, and that even the mightiest empires and the most successful rulers must eventually give way to new circumstances and different forms of organization. However, the memory of great achievements in governance culture and human cooperation continues to inspire and instruct future generations, while also providing comfort and perspective to those who seek to understand the long patterns of historical development. The Persian Empire at its height represented one of humanity's most successful experiments in creating unity from diversity and in governing vast territories inhabited by peoples of different languages, religions, and cultural traditions through methods that emphasized accommodation rather than domination. These ancient achievements in multicultural administration and peaceful imperial governance continue to offer valuable lessons for modern students of politics and international relations, while also providing inspiring examples of human cooperation across cultural boundaries. As the gentle flames beside us begin to burn lower, we can feel the peaceful weight of all these ancient stories settling over us like a warm blanket that brings comfort and security, while also encouraging the deep rest that allows our minds and bodies to recover from the challenges of daily life. The chronicles of Persian kings and their vast empires have carried us far from the concerns of the modern world into a realm of ancient wisdom and timeless human experiences that transcend the boundaries of specific cultures and historical periods. The rise and fall of the Persian Empire teaches us about the importance of effective leadership, the value of cultural tolerance, and the necessity of adapting to changing circumstances, while also reminding us that all human achievements are part of larger patterns of historical development that extend far beyond individual lives and specific political arrangements. These lessons from the ancient world provide perspective and comfort as we face our own challenges, while also encouraging us to appreciate the remarkable resilience and creativity that human beings have demonstrated throughout history. The gentle rhythm of these historical narratives has helped to quiet the restless thoughts that so often prevent peaceful sleep, while also filling our minds with images of ancient landscapes, palace gardens, flowing rivers, and distant mountains that provide a soothing backdrop for rest and renewal. The stories of Persian kings and their subjects remind us of the fundamental human experiences of hope, ambition, achievement, and loss that connect us across the centuries to all those who have gone before us in the long journey of human civilization. As the fire burns down to glowing embers that cast their soft light on the walls around us, we can feel ourselves drifting toward the edge of sleep, where the boundary between waking consciousness and peaceful dreams becomes blurred and indistinct. The ancient voices that have spoken to us through these chronicles of empire and conquest gradually fade into a gentle murmur that mingles with the quiet crackling of the dying fire and the soft sounds of night settling over the world. The vast landscapes of the Persian Empire spread out before our mind's eye like a great tapestry woven from countless individual stories of merchants and farmers, soldiers and administrators, kings and common people, all of whom played their parts in the grand drama. of human civilization. The palaces of Persepolis rise in our imagination with their magnificent columns and relief sculptures, while the royal road stretches across mountains and deserts, connecting distant provinces and carrying messages and travelers between the far corners of the ancient world. In this peaceful twilight between waking and sleeping, we can almost hear the gentle sounds of ancient life, the lowing of cattle in Persian pastures, the voices of merchants in Babylonian markets, the splash of oars in the harbors of Phoenician cities, and the whispered prayers in temples dedicated to gods whose names have been forgotten for thousands of years. These quiet echoes from the distant past blend together into a soothing lullaby that carries us deeper into the realm of rest and restoration. The stories we have shared tonight remind us that we are part of a great continuing narrative that began long before our birth and will continue long after our individual lives have ended. This connection to the larger flow of human experience provides comfort and meaning, while also encouraging the kind of peaceful acceptance that allows for deep and restorative sleep. The ancient Persian Empire has given us its gifts of wisdom, tolerance, and the example of human achievement on a grand scale, while also teaching us about the importance of humility and the temporary nature of all earthly power. As consciousness slowly fades and the boundary between thought and dream dissolves completely, we can rest in the knowledge that these ancient stories will continue to offer their quiet wisdom to future generations, while the eternal cycle of human experience continues its patient unfolding across the centuries. The gentle flames have now died down to barely visible embers, but their warmth remains to comfort us through the peaceful hours of night, while our minds and bodies restore themselves in preparation for whatever tomorrow may bring. The Persian Empire sleeps now in the pages of history, but its legacy lives on in the continuing human quest for justice, wisdom, and the peaceful cooperation of diverse peoples united by common hopes and shared humanity. In this spirit of ancient wisdom and timeless peace, we can now allow ourselves to drift into the deepest and most restorative sleep, knowing that we carry with us the gentle strength and enduring hope that have sustained human civilization through all its trials and transformations across the endless expanse of time. Sweet dreams await in the quiet darkness, where the voices of ancient kings and the wisdom of long-vanished empires blend together into the eternal lullaby that has comforted humanity since the beginning of time. Rest now in peace, knowing that you are part of this great continuing story, and that tomorrow's dawn will bring new possibilities for achievement, understanding, and the endless human journey toward wisdom and compassion. The fire has burned down to its final embers, and the ancient chronicles have shared their last whispered secrets as we settle into the deep, peaceful sleep that restores both body and spirit. Good night, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with the gentle wisdom and timeless peace that flow like rivers through all the stories of human civilization, past, present, and future.